Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the smoke-streaked, rain-slick world of Victorian Britain, where life is brutal, coal is king, and the kitchen table, if you even had one, is more survival zone than comfort zone. Forget quaint tea parties and lacy biscuits. The real meals people ate to get through this era, not only would they not pass a modern food inspection, they'd probably have you crawling to the nearest doctor with food poisoning and a deep sense of betrayal. You might think you're ready for this, but let's be real. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and current time in the comments. Curious to know who's winding down the day with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's London 1850. The air stinks of soot, sweat and sewage. You shuffle down a muddy cobblestone alley, past smoke-belching chimneys and children with bare feet darting between carts. A bell tolls somewhere in the haze. You haven't eaten since yesterday, not properly. Your belly growls, but there's nothing in your pocket but a button and a pebble. You're not alone. Thousands of others around you are in the same boat, trying to stretch a few pennies into a week's worth of calories. And calories, not flavour, are the name of the game here. You're looking for bulk, anything to stop that hollow ache in your stomach. It's not about liking the food, it's about filling your gut just enough to keep going. That's why people turn to things like gruel, a slurry of oats, water, maybe milk if you're lucky, boiled into a grey, lukewarm sludge. It's prison food now, but back then it was a fact of life. Hospitals, orphanages, workhouses and even family homes all had a pot bubbling with this stuff. It's cheap, stretches forever, and looks like wallpaper paste. Gruel wasn't just food. It was practically a symbol. If you were eating it, you were poor. If you were being served it at a workhouse, it came with a dose of humiliation and a strict warning not to ask for seconds, Oliver Twist style. It was also a food of punishment given to prisoners, scolded schoolboys, and others deemed too unruly or too expendable for better fare. But if you were starving, you ate your gruel and counted yourself lucky. The thing is, people didn't just accept hunger. They got inventive with what they had. You'd find old women boiling sheep bones for the fourth or fifth time, squeezing out the last ghost of flavour to make a thin broth they'd sip like tea. You might stumble across a market vendor selling leftover cabbage water as vegetable soup. And yes, there were entire stalls selling bone tea, not some fancy collagen health trend, but a real wretched attempt to get some nutrients out of whatever was left after the butcher did his worst. That's your first historical fact tonight. In the 1850s, Britain, even the flavourless runoff from boiled bones was marketed and sold to the poor as a meal. Now let's add a weird one. Some people, especially in the countryside, actually ate clay. No joke. Pica, the craving for non-food items, was common among malnourished folks. People would dig up white clay or chalky soil and nibble at it, hoping to calm the stomach's gnawing emptiness. Of course, it didn't help nutritionally, but desperate times make desperate snacks. The whole system, from what you could eat to how it was prepared, had one giant pressure point: class. Food wasn't just about nourishment, it was a social billboard. The kind of bread on your table told people what rung of the ladder you stood on. White bread, expensive, refined, upper class. Coarse brown bread with bits of husk still in it. That's the pauper's loaf. The same applied to cuts of meat, if you ever got to see any. Sirloin was for the elite. Tripe, offal, and feet were for everybody else. And if you had no money, well, then, you just hoped someone tossed a heel of bread your way before the rats got to it. But here's the scholarly grey area we should talk about. Did poor Victorians really eat as terribly as we think? Some historians argue that the worst cases, the famished orphans, the bone boilers, the arsenic-spiced buns, yes, we'll get there, are overrepresented. Maybe there was more variety than we give credit for. Maybe communal cooking, neighbourly sharing, or clever gardening made more of a dent in poverty than the archives show. Or maybe we just like to imagine it grimmer than it was because the drama is easier to swallow than the gruel. Still, when you zoom out, one thing's clear. Unless you were wealthy or extremely lucky, you weren't dining. You were surviving. Every meal was a calculation. Every bite was either a compromise or a miracle. And if you found something hot, filling and vaguely chewable, that was cause for celebration. So tonight, as you snuggle under your blankets with your snacks and clean water and soft pillows, spare a thought for the factory girl warming her hands on a tin of half-rotten stew. or the dock worker chasing down a coal cart vendor for a roasted potato, burned black on the outside but still better than nothing. Or the child sneaking crusts from the dog's bowl because he hadn't eaten since Thursday. And that's just the first course. Hope you're hungry for more. By now, you're probably picturing a bleak bowl of gruel, maybe a charred root vegetable or two, and wondering, what else did people actually eat when things got even worse than usual? Well, pull up a cracked wooden stool because tonight's special is gruel's equally sad cousin. Thin porridge and its many names: water porridge, stirabout, and the very Victorian-sounding sop. Let's just say that when you're waking up in a damp tenement with mould creeping down the walls and rats singing lullabies from the floorboards, you're not frying eggs and bacon. You're boiling oats again and hoping the neighbour doesn't steal your salt. In most lower-class households, breakfast wasn't so much a meal as it was a ritual of resignation. You boil water, you add oats, you stir slowly. Maybe you add a splash of skimmed milk if you've got any left. Maybe a sugar lump if someone dropped one. But usually it's just mush, hot, tasteless and slightly grey from the kettle that hasn't been scrubbed since your aunt died in it. You slurp it quietly while everyone around you pretends not to mind chewing the same flavourless spoonfuls day after day. But here's the twist. People needed this. Gruel, for all its soggy disappointment, was kind to weak stomachs and stretched supplies like a magician pulling scarves out of a hat. If you watered it down enough, it fed more mouths. If you thickened it with barley or lentils, it could feel like something hearty. And if you got creative, you might stir in shavings of old bread crusts or potato skins. The trick was convincing your body it was full long enough to make it through another exhausting day. Gruel wasn't just for the poor, though. Institutions loved it too. Schools, prisons and orphanages served it with mechanical regularity, spooned out in controlled portions like punishment disguised as nutrition. The Charles Dickens version of this isn't exaggerated. Little kids really did line up for slop that slid off their spoons like wet cement. One whistle meant breakfast, another meant stop talking, and the third, that was just the rats changing shifts. Now here's a lesser-known truth. In wealthier homes, gruel wasn't entirely off the menu. If you were sick, hungover, or nursing a delicate constitution, whatever that means, gruel was considered restorative. Fancy gruel even had nutmeg. Yes, nutmeg. They'd grate it right on top and call it medicine. And don't forget cinnamon. If you could afford the spice rack, you could disguise gruel as something almost pleasant. But don't get it twisted. Nobody was excited to eat it. Even the Queen herself would have wrinkled her nose. Here's your historical fact for this round. Gruel was so closely associated with institutionalisation that by the late 1800s it became a shorthand for dehumanisation in political cartoons. If you wanted to insult a government programme, just draw a sad child being handed a bowl of gruel with a ladle the size of a cricket bat. People got the message instantly. Let's sprinkle in a weird one. Gruel was sometimes used in the spiritualist community as a cleansing food before seances. Yep, followers of mystical diets believed that heavy food blocked your connection to the spirit world. Want to talk to Aunt Mildred from beyond the veil? Better clear the pipes with oat water first. And now to the debate. Was gruel ever actually nutritious? Some historians argue that, for all its watery blandness, it wasn't so bad. Oats, barley and other porridge grains carried decent amounts of fibre, carbs and even trace minerals. But critics say the real problem was that people often stretched it too far, diluting it to the point where it did little more than warm your hands. A spoonful of nutrition in a sea of water doesn't go far when you're burning calories, scrubbing floors, hauling coal, or walking miles to sell firewood. Let's not forget who was doing the cooking. Most working-class women in Victorian England spent entire days planning, preparing and managing food that had next to no ingredients. Imagine opening your pantry and seeing oats, salt, 2 onions, a turnip with a worm in it, and half a lump of suet that's starting to go green. That's dinner for 7. Good luck. You chop, you boil, you pray, and then you serve it with a smile like it's roast duck. And when your kids still cry themselves to sleep with empty bellies, you pretend you're not hungry just so they'll eat your portion. But despite its pitiful presentation, gruel and other hot porridges became emotional anchors. They were warm, predictable. They didn't rot quickly or require fancy pots. And in the bleakest homes, the sound of a spoon clinking against the side of a chipped bowl could be comforting, especially in winter, when the pipes froze and the wind howled down chimneys like a banshee looking for lost souls. You can picture yourself now, huddled close to the single stove that barely works, spoon in hand, steam curling up in ghostly spirals. The fire gives off more smoke than heat. Someone's coughing. Someone's singing a lullaby in the other room. And as you choke down your fourth bowl of mush this week, you think, at least it's hot. Now contrast that with the newspapers of the time, which were often filled with lavish descriptions of upper-class dining rooms, glittering with silver tureens and overflowing with roast meats, game birds, and puddings shaped like crowns. No wonder the poor resented the rich. They weren't just hungry, they were being teased by headlines. That hunger made people dream bigger. Maybe tomorrow you'd find a few pennies and buy a heel of decent bread. Maybe a kind butcher would toss you a soup bone with actual marrow. Or maybe you'd risk the street food stalls and try your luck with something fried in reused lard. But that's for another day. For now, you wipe your spoon, nestle into a scratchy wool blanket, and let your stomach settle. You made it through the meal, and the day. That's good enough. So your stomach's rumbling again, and honestly, Gruel's not cutting it anymore. It slides down too fast, leaves you cold and unsatisfied. You want something heartier, with at least the illusion of substance. That's when you look toward one of the more reliable sources of nourishment in the Victorian survival diet. Bones. Not meat, not stew, just bones. Boiled bones. Maybe beef, if it was a good day. Mutton if the butcher had leftovers. More likely, though, something ambiguous, brittle, and barely legal to sell. You walk into the cramped kitchen of a slum apartment, or one-room dwelling shared with 6 other people. The fireplace, if you have one, has been lit with scraps of coal and scavenged wood. A blackened kettle caked with years of soot hangs from a rusted hook. Into that kettle go the bones. Old, stripped of any meat, maybe gnawed by someone else first. Doesn't matter. You fill the pot with water, maybe toss in a slice of onion peel or a bit of celery leaf if someone found one behind the market stall. Then you let it bubble. Hours pass. The room fills with a greasy, meaty scent. Comforting if you're lucky enough to smell it before your senses dull from exhaustion. This is bone tea. Or beef tea, if you want to dress it up Victorian style. You don't chew it. You don't eat anything solid. You just sip the hot broth and hope it warms you enough to get out the door. It's barely a meal, more like a whisper of what a meal used to be. But the body doesn't argue. It takes what it can get. You might not be alone either. This sort of communal boiling was a group effort. Neighbours shared bones. One person had the pot, another had a few shreds of vegetable peelings, and someone else might have the salt. These weren't just meals, they were social rituals wrapped in desperation. People took turns keeping watch over the pot, stirring slowly, adding water to stretch the flavour further. Some bones were reused for days. Yes, days. It's not glamorous, but here's your historical fact. Victorian cookbooks, especially those aimed at charitable households and frugal wives, included entire sections dedicated to the art of boiling bones properly. There were instructions for how long to simmer, when to skim, and even how to season the tea with stale bread or flour to make a sort of soup sludge hybrid. These weren't ironic hacks. They were real earnest attempts to make the most out of nearly nothing. Now let's lean into the weird. In the mid-Victorian period, there was a belief floating around that bone tea could revive the dying. Doctors sometimes prescribed it for the weak, the elderly, and even patients suffering from tuberculosis. It was seen as a miracle tonic, even though we now know it's mostly warm water, with trace amounts of fat and minerals. And here's the kicker. Hospitals charged extra for it. If your family could afford the bone broth, they bought you time. If not, well, you probably didn't need a lunch menu for long. There's a debate that lingers, though. Was this kind of meal actually effective at keeping people going? On the one hand, yes. Hot broth gave warmth, hydration, and just enough protein to keep someone breathing. On the other, critics argue it was more psychological than nutritional. It felt like you were eating something substantial, which made you think you had energy, even if the reality was a stomach full of flavoured water. In some ways, that placebo effect probably kept more people alive than the broth itself. And let's be honest, you had to convince yourself it was worth it. You stare down into the kettle and see nothing but murky greyness. Maybe a bubble pops on the surface. A fleck of old cartilage floats by like a soggy ghost of Sunday dinner. This is what survival looks like in Victorian England. Not just poverty, but the normalisation of edible nothingness. But hey, if you were lucky, or if you bribed the butcher's apprentice with a favour, You might get a bone with a hint of marrow still inside. Now that was a treat. You'd take a pin, maybe a nail, and scoop out the soft, fatty centre like it was a delicacy. Because in your world, it was. A tablespoon of pure, buttery marrow could fuel your aching body for a full shift on the docks or a day hauling laundry. By now, you're developing what we might generously call a palate. You start ranking bones by flavour. Cow knuckles? Not bad. Mutton neck? Very oily, but rich. Chicken backs? Meh, too bland. Pigtails? An acquired taste. This grim little food taxonomy becomes part of daily life. People talk about it in line at the soup kitchen, compare notes, trade rumours about where the best bones might be dumped behind the meat market. Then there's the improvisation. You've got broth. Great. Now what? Maybe you thicken it with flour to make it last. Maybe you dip stale bread into it and pretend it's stew. Maybe you drink it cold the next morning because reheating uses up precious coal. Every step is a trade-off. Every bite a bargain. Even the water's suspect, thick with mineral runoff and urban sludge. So boiling it with bones might actually purify it a little, though you'll never be sure. You might even be tempted to walk to a street vendor, the ones with iron pots set on coals, ladling out steaming cups for a penny or two. It's a risk, though. Some of those vendors water down their broth so far it tastes like dishwater. Others are known for scalding their pots so badly, every serving tastes like burnt metal. But if you're tired and freezing, a hot cup from a stranger might be worth the gamble. It's the end of another day, and your stomach has that hollow metallic echo that tells you you've eaten, but barely. Still, you sit back by the fire, or maybe just under a broken window, and feel the faint warmth still sitting in your chest. That broth, as thin and forgettable as it was, has bought you another few hours of motion, of thought, of life, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. You'll chase bones. You'll boil them to dust. You'll believe in the magic of hot water and hope. It's morning again, and the streets are already alive with clatter and smoke. You button up your threadbare coat not because it's warm, it isn't, but because it hides your hunger. There's nothing in your belly but yesterday's bone broth, and a stubborn optimism that maybe you'll find something on the streets today. Not charity exactly, not handouts, just something warm, edible, and cheap. Maybe even a treat, if you squint hard enough and don't think too much about where it came from. Welcome to the bustling world of Victorian street food, where snacks come covered in soot and seasoning is more about survival than spice. You duck under a dripping awning, and there it is, a steaming cart surrounded by a tangle of hungry Londoners. The vendor barks out prices between clouds of vapour. The options, not great, but filling. A handful of hot chestnuts wrapped in paper still smoking from the coals, a wedge of fried potato cooked to near carbon in reused lard. And the crowd favourite. Boiled sheep's trotters. Yes, sheep feet. Think chewy gelatin, tiny bones, and a rubbery skin that squeaks against your teeth. Street vendors are the unsung heroes of the working poor's stomach. They're not respected. They're not clean. But they're there, when nothing else is. You don't need a kitchen, a pot, or a single match to eat what they sell. You just need a penny. Maybe two, and luck. Because this food might sustain you, or it might make you sick. There's always that whisper in the back of your mind. How many times has that pot of oil been reused? Did they actually wash that meat before tossing it on the griddle? Probably not. But when you're desperate, questions are luxuries. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-1800s, London alone had thousands of street food vendors. The city's poor relied on them daily, and they even had a nickname, the street purveyors of comfort. Comfort is a generous word. Most sold greasy, heavily salted food designed to hit your stomach like a brick and keep you full just long enough to work. Items included pig's ears, fried fish scraps, meat pies of uncertain origin, pickled whelks, and more. Let's toss in a quirky twist. Ever hear of hot pea soup boys? That was a real thing. Young lads, often no older than 10, would walk the streets with buckets of thick pea soup, ladling out portions to customers who drank it from communal mugs or tin cans. No washing between customers, no napkins, just you, the soup, and the hope that the last guy didn't have consumption. And now the debate. Did Victorian street food make life better, or worse? Some scholars argue these vendors filled a crucial gap, feeding the masses when indoor kitchens were rare and time was money. Others point out the food was often dangerously contaminated. food safety laws were still decades away from having teeth. The lard used to fry that potato. It might have been sitting out all week. That meat pie could have been made of cat, or rat, or spoiled offal dressed up in a flaky crust. People didn't just get stomach aches, they got typhoid, cholera, worse. So yes, street food kept you alive, but sometimes it didn't. Still, there's a thrill to it. You step up to a vendor, hand over your coin, and receive a little paper parcel so greasy it stains your fingers on contact. Inside, roasted potatoes split open like overcooked books, their scorched skins hiding a soft, almost creamy centre. Or a skewer of eel, slightly charred, coiled up like some ancient sea monster on a stick. Or, if you've really lucked out, a hot meat pudding, its crust flaking apart to reveal, well, something vaguely meat-like. You don't ask what it is, that's the rule. The streets themselves contribute flavour, if we're being poetic. Everything's damp, fog mixed with smoke from coal fires and horse manure. The air tastes like soot and rain. Your hands are blackened from touching every surface. But the food's hot, and that's all that matters. You eat with your fingers tearing into the flaky crust, licking off the grease, blowing on each bite. No cutlery, no etiquette. Just survival, Victorian style. You might pass a man with a tray hanging from his neck hawking hard toffee or penny licks. Small glasses filled with cheap ice cream or custard that are licked clean and handed back for reuse. Think about that for a second. Everyone used the same glass. You finish, hand it back, and the next guy uses it. Between that and the soup boys, germs had a highway. Still, these snacks had their place. Children would spend their last farthing on a toffee apple, gnawing at it until it cracked a tooth. Adults leaned against walls, eating pickled eggs out of jars, wincing with each bite. And for many, the act of eating on the street, shoulder to shoulder with neighbours and strangers, became one of the few moments of shared human experience in an otherwise gruelling day. Because here's what the history books don't always capture. These weren't just food vendors, they were anchors. You saw them every morning on your walk to work, every evening on your stagger home. Their smoke signalled safety. Their clatter was a lullaby of routine, even if the food made you gag, even if it barely filled the cracks inside you. It reminded you that life was still happening. You weren't forgotten. You weren't entirely invisible. So tonight, as you finish your oily paper bundle and wipe your fingers on your already dirty sleeve, you lean back against the brick wall of a tenement building and look around. The fog curls like a cat around lampposts. A man sings somewhere down the alley. You feel something close to warmth in your belly, a strange gratitude for the unnamed vendor who gave you calories instead of kindness, and that's enough. It has to be. It's raining again, of course. The kind of fine, cold drizzle that soaks you through without you noticing until your bones start to ache. You duck under a crooked awning, wiping water from your brow with a sleeve already damp from yesterday, and glance down at the small lumpy prize in your palm, a potato, still warm just barely. Scorched on one side from its time buried in hot coals, its skin crisp in patches and splitting open to show a steaming golden interior. It's not much. But tonight, this potato is everything. Victorians didn't just eat potatoes, they depended on them. Across the classes, though especially among the poor, the potato became the most reliable, flexible, and forgiving staple in the Victorian diet. Cheap to grow, quick to cook, and dense with energy, it could be roasted, boiled, mashed, fried, baked, or grated. You could make soup with it, thicken a stew, or just eat it plain with a pinch of salt. Maybe a smear of lard if you had it. It was filler, fuel, and famine fighter all in one. And the love affair wasn't limited to England. In Ireland, potatoes were a way of life. Entire families depended on them for daily sustenance. Until, of course, they didn't. When the blight hit in the 1840s, it blackened entire fields of potatoes, leaving millions without their main source of nutrition. The result? Mass starvation, and one of the most catastrophic famines in European history. And even though this story often centres around Ireland, the ripple effects were felt across Britain too. Migrants flooded into cities, chasing jobs and food, and with them came an even deeper reliance on the humble spud. So here's your historical fact for tonight. By the mid-19th century, working-class families in Britain were eating an average of 10 pounds of potatoes per person per week. That's not a typo, 10 pounds. Potatoes were often eaten at every meal, boiled for breakfast, mashed for lunch, baked or fried for dinner. There were even potato clubs where workers pooled money to bulk buy potatoes in winter months when they were more expensive. And then there were the baked potato vendors, the unsung heroes of cold Victorian nights. These weren't fancy food carts, more like soot-blackened barrels on wheels with glowing embers inside and a sack of potatoes piled on top. You'd smell them before you saw them, the char, the smoke, the slightly sweet, earthy scent of a perfectly scorched potato. A warm one cost a penny, maybe a halfpenny if the vendor liked your face or didn't notice you were short. For the hungry and homeless, this was one of the few foods that came hot, cheap and filling. Now for your quirky tidbit, some Victorian street vendors didn't just sell potatoes, they rented them. No, really. They would lend hot baked potatoes to customers as hand warmers in winter. You paid a small fee to carry one around in your coat pocket to keep your fingers warm, and when it cooled, you gave it back, or paid extra to eat it. In some parts of London, this was so common that kids would race between vendors trying to get a free warm-up. There's something strangely comforting about the potatoes role in all this. It asked for little, gave back a lot. No fancy preparation required, no cutlery. You could eat it with your hands, tear off the skin with your teeth, share it with your family or squirrel it away for later. Even the leftovers could be fried into cakes or mashed into bread. It was the one food that felt like a small victory. A meal, however modest, that actually felt like a meal. Still, scholars debate whether the potato really helped alleviate poverty, or just made it more manageable. Was it a tool of resilience, or a way of pacifying the masses with something that filled them up without solving the deeper problems? Some argue that potatoes enable landlords and employers to keep wages low. After all, if you could survive on tubers and a pinch of salt, what incentive was there to pay more? But for you right now, standing in a crooked alley with steam rising from the cracks in your baked potato like a miniature volcano, none of that matters. You take a bite, the soft inside nearly sweet against your tongue, and close your eyes for a second. It's hot, it's solid. It'll sit in your stomach like ballast. That's what you need. There's even a tiny sliver of charred skin stuck between your teeth. A sure sign that this one's been roasted long and hard just the way you like it. Later you might scrape together a meal from the rest of your meagre larder. A bit of onion, maybe some leftover greens if they haven't gone slimy, a heel of bread. But right now, this potato is centre stage. It makes your fingers burn, it fogs up your breath, and it makes the endless grey sky above you feel a little less oppressive. As you eat, you see others doing the same. Men crouched by gutters, women sitting on crates, children sharing bites with grubby fingers. No one talks. There's no need. This moment is sacred in its own quiet way. Warmth, food, and a pause between hardships. The rain keeps falling, but for now, at least your stomach is full. Morning begins before the sun shows its face, as it always does. You roll off a straw-stuffed mattress that smells faintly of mildew and the kind of sweat that never fully dries. Your joints ache, but there's no time to linger. You're a charwoman, a cleaner of houses, floors, fireplaces, and sometimes reputations. You're out the door before half the city has stirred, walking fast to keep warm, your boots squelching with the previous night's rain. You won't be back until after dark, and everything you eat today has to be fast, cheap, and easy to carry. Breakfast. If you can call it that, it's going to be brutal. In the cramped room you rent, more closet than home, you heat a tin mug of water over a sputtering flame. The luxury of tea has long since evaporated. Today, it's just warm water with a splash of milk so thin it might as well be a memory. You stare at the loaf of coarse brown bread on the counter. It's hard at the edges and dry through the middle, but it's what you have. You break off a piece and chew slowly, grinding your teeth through the gritty texture. It tastes faintly of sourdough, mostly of dust. Maybe you'll find a bit of cheese in your apron pocket from yesterday, if it hasn't gone stiff with age. This is the charwoman's breakfast. Fast, dry. No time for plates. You eat while tying your shoes. You eat while pinning up your hair. The bread is barely down your throat before you're out the door, wrapped in a shawl, dodging coal wagons and stray dogs as the city stretches awake around you. You won't eat again for hours, not because you're fasting, but because there's no break in your day long enough to allow for it. And even if you had time, well, eating at work isn't really an option. You're surrounded by things you'll never own: silver cutlery, ceramic teapots, fresh fruit in painted bowls. But none of it's for you. You dust it, polish it, clean it, then leave before the family sits down to enjoy their scones and tea. You might sneak a crumb, here or there, a corner of toast someone left untouched, a cold bit of bacon rind no one would miss. But it's risky. Servants have been dismissed for less. Your historical fact of the day: charwomen were some of the hardest working and lowest paid labourers in Victorian England. They often worked for multiple households in a single day, sometimes cleaning by candlelight, sometimes while dodging insults or unwanted advances. Their wages were barely enough to cover rent and food, and many shared beds in shifts with other working women. Meals were never guaranteed. Now for your quirky fact. Ready for this one? Some charwomen used soot as a beauty product. They'd mix chimney soot with a little grease and apply it as eyeliner or brow filler. There wasn't money for cosmetics, so the fireplace became both the job and the makeup counter. Fashion and filth, in a strange little alliance. Here's the debate though. Was this constant low-grade starvation a result of poverty alone, or of the social systems that deliberately overlooked these women? Some historians argue that Victorian domestic manuals encouraged employers to see servants, and especially charwomen, not as people with bodies that needed fuel, but as part of the house machinery. Efficient, replaceable, not meant to be fed unless specifically contracted to stay overnight. In other words, invisible at the table. And invisible is exactly how you feel, even as you scrub the scullery floor with a rag soaked in vinegar and ash. Your stomach growls, but there's no point noticing it. You pour the bucket again, you wipe again, you stand again, you move until the ache in your back merges with the emptiness in your belly. There's always more to clean, always more to do. You tell yourself that maybe the lady of the house will be generous and let you take the stale rolls left over from breakfast, but she probably won't. She never does. You watch from the hallway as her children eat in their dressing gowns, talking about pudding and boiled eggs like they're nothing. You remember boiled eggs, round, hot, soft at the centre. You haven't had one in over a year. Midday comes and goes without notice. You nibble the last bit of bread you saved from this morning, careful to chew slowly so it feels like more. It doesn't. You drink another tin of water from the pump outside. It's metallic and cold and leaves a strange aftertaste. Still, it fills the space for a while. You keep moving. By the time the sun begins to sink and the gas lamps flicker to life, you're dragging your feet back through the alleys toward home. Maybe you'll stop at a vendor's cart if you've earned a spare halfpenny. If not, it's back to the bread if there's any left. Sometimes you close your eyes and dream about butter, the kind that glistens yellow on a warm crust. Just the idea of it makes your mouth water. But here's the real kicker. No matter how little you eat, you're expected to do everything. You're supposed to be reliable, cheerful, nimble, invisible. Employers complain if you look tired, if your apron's wrinkled, if your hands are cracked from soap. Hunger isn't a valid excuse. You're poor, yes, but you must also be polished. So you go to bed that night with the ache still inside you. It's more than hunger now. It's a kind of slow, gnawing numbness. Your legs twitch from fatigue. Your stomach churns in its emptiness, but you're too tired to care. You close your eyes on a growl and hope that in the morning someone will leave a crust behind, or a drip of tea, or anything at all. By now, your stomach is as accustomed to disappointment as your feet are to blisters. But tonight, there's a rumour floating down the alleyways and across the markets. Eels. Someone's got fresh eels, not the dainty decorative slices served in posh parlours with silver forks and lemon curls, but the full, writhing, still slimy kind that get chopped up and dumped into a pie before they can finish their last squirm. It doesn't sound appetising, not really. But in the Victorian underworld of edibility, eels are practically gold. You follow your nose down to the docks, past the fishmongers shouting over each other, and the clouds of seagulls screeching like they've just seen the future, and it's all rotten haddock. There, in a chipped wooden cart, is what you're after. A pile of still glossy eels, slick as oil, coiled together in a sloshing tub. The vendor's got strong arms, a tired face, and a cleaver that's seen better centuries. He's already hacking through the pile, sending chunks flying into a dented bowl. You've scraped together enough for a small eel pie. Don't imagine anything grand. There's no pastry top like the ones in cookbooks or buttery layers folded by delicate fingers. This is more like dough armour. Thick, chewy, and designed to keep the contents from leaking, not to taste good. Inside is the eel. Fatty, rich, slightly fishy, and full of tiny bones you have to navigate like a cart through cobbled streets. Still, it's warm. It smells of brine and something vaguely sweet. Maybe onions, maybe lies. You don't ask. You eat. Here's your historical fact. Eels were one of the most accessible proteins for London's working poor during the 19th century. The Thames, before it was completely choked with industrial waste, was teeming with them. Eels could survive in filthy water and were easy to catch, smoke or preserve in jelly. They became a staple at street stalls and cheap cook shops, served stewed, boiled or, most famously, jellied. Ah yes, jellied eels. Victorians had a thing for gelatin, especially the kind made by boiling animal bones and cartilage until it turned into wobbly horror. Eels, with their naturally gelatinous texture, were a perfect fit. Once cooked and cooled, the eel meat would set in a clear jelly, served cold, often with a splash of vinegar or hot pepper sauce. If you grew up with it, it was a taste of home. If not, well, it was still food, mostly. Now here's the quirky twist. In some London neighbourhoods, eel pie shops became social hubs, like the fast food joints of the East End. You'd pop in for a pie, sit elbow to elbow with chimney sweeps, dock workers and washerwomen, and shovel down your meal while swapping gossip or plotting your next hustle. These places weren't just for eating, they were for surviving together, a sort of low-budget community centre with fish bones. But not everyone loved eel. In fact, here's the debate. Were eels a desperate food or a cultural favourite? Some historians insist eel dishes were cherished, with recipes passed down and eel catching seen as a family tradition in some riverside communities. Others point out that as the river grew more polluted and the city more crowded, eels became associated with poverty and hardship, more necessity than choice. If you could afford beef or chicken, you probably weren't choosing eel. Unless, of course, you were from the East End, where eel pride runs deep and has somehow survived into modern menus, jelly and all. You finish your pie and lick the last bit of eel juice from your thumb, careful not to waste a drop. The bones, tiny and white, pile up like the memory of a real meal. You feel strangely satisfied. Not full, exactly, but held over. Eel is heavy in the stomach, a kind of oily anchor that keeps you from drifting into the numbness of hunger again too soon. Later, walking back through the alleys, you pass a child gnawing on a piece of smoked eel skin, salty and blackened at the edges. He holds it like a treat, like a lollipop for the apocalypse. You remember your own first taste, your face wrinkling, eyes watering, then slowly understanding that this oily, fishy, strange textured thing could keep you alive. It wasn't love at first bite, it was survival. Back home, or what passes for it, the others ask if you brought anything back. You shake your head. Not because you're selfish, but because there wasn't enough. You share stories instead, about the vendor's cleaver, the way the eels looked like river ghosts, the heat of the pepper sauce that made your nose run. For a moment everyone laughs. For a moment the hunger's replaced by something else. And that's how it went in Victorian England. Food wasn't just about calories, it was about luck, stories, the strange pride that came from eating something that would make your upper-class employers faint. Eels weren't glamorous, they weren't even pleasant, but they were yours, caught from your river, cooked by your people, eaten on your terms. So tonight, as your stomach digests the strange sea-dweller you've wrestled into submission, you lie back and let the warmth of the pie linger just a little longer. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't clean, but it was real. And sometimes real is more than enough. You wake up to coughing, not your own, but someone else's, dry, persistent, and far too close. It echoes through the shared hallway like a clock ticking down, one lung-rattling bark at a time. You pull the threadbare blanket tighter around your shoulders and glance across the room. There, curled on the floor like a discarded coat, is your youngest brother. His ribs move fast with every breath. He hasn't eaten since yesterday, maybe the day before. Honestly, it's hard to keep track. You count time in crusts now. You're 12, maybe 13. It doesn't really matter. You're not in school and you haven't been for years. Instead, you spend your days working, sometimes at the match factory, sometimes sweeping chimneys, sometimes hawking newspapers or scrubbing pots in a tavern kitchen. Anything that earns a coin, anything that might put something, anything, in your stomach. Child labour isn't a misfortune, it's the rule. You don't know anyone who doesn't work. Every kid on your street, boys and girls alike, has a job, or 3. Some lucky ones find apprenticeships, but most do the dirty, dangerous jobs no one else wants. Chimney sweeps, mudlarks, factory hands, crossing sweepers. You're bone thin and fast, which makes you perfect for crawling into places adults can't reach. You're paid pennies for hours of work. It's hard, it's cold, but what hits hardest is the hunger. Today breakfast is the same as yesterday. Nothing. You tuck your cap over your ears, stuff your hands in your pockets, and head out into the London morning. The streets already stink of smoke and wet horse manure. Your stomach groans at the sight of a bakery window, a row of warm loaves sitting just out of reach. You press your nose against the glass, half from hunger, half for the warmth it radiates. Then you move on. Staring too long makes it worse. By mid-morning you're at the factory. It's hot, loud, and filled with the clatter of machines that could take your fingers if you blink wrong. There's no lunch break, just a few stolen minutes behind the shed where you and the other boys chew on whatever you've scrounged. Stale crusts, a lump of sweet wrapped in paper, maybe a dried apple slice. It's not eating, it's stalling. You sip water from a rusty tin, and it goes down like regret. Here's your historical fact. Victorian children made up a significant portion of the urban workforce, especially in industries like textiles, coal mining, and domestic service. Their wages were a fraction of an adult's, and many lived on the barest edge of survival. Most did not eat 3 meals a day. Many didn't even eat one. And now, for your fringe fact, Victorian children were often given beer or gin instead of water, not to get drunk, though it happened, but because the water was often too polluted to drink. Gin was sometimes cheaper than milk, and it dulled hunger pangs. You'd see toddlers sipping from tin cups filled with gin-laced broth, falling asleep in doorways with cheeks pink from more than just the cold. So what's the scholarly argument here? Some say working children were simply doing what their parents and grandparents had done for generations. Others point out the Industrial Revolution transformed childhood into something transactional. Your body became a commodity, measured by your ability to endure hunger, injury, and exhaustion. Food, in this context, was not nourishment, it was fuel. If you didn't earn it, you didn't deserve it. And if you starved, well, someone else would take your place tomorrow. You feel it in your bones by afternoon. That awful combination of fatigue and emptiness. Your hands tremble. Your vision swims. You know what that means. You need something. Even a lump of raw turnip or a crust stolen from a cart. On your walk home, you slow near a grocer's stall. The man isn't looking. There's a bruised apple on the edge of the pile. Your fingers twitch. But stealing's dangerous. You've seen what happens. Boys your age dragged by the collar into courtrooms and sentenced to hard labour for pinching a loaf. One girl, Mary, from 2 streets over, got sent to the workhouse for stealing a cold sausage. Her only defence was, "I was starving, sir." The judge didn't blink. Instead, you look for scraps. Piles of cabbage leaves on the curb, bits of pie crust thrown out by kitchens. You and the rats are in the same race. If you're quick, you win. You find a bit of fish skin near a stall and bite down, teeth scraping over tough scales. It tastes like salt and sadness, but it's something. It'll get you through the night. Back home, the room's no warmer than outside. Your mother's asleep in the chair, face grey with fatigue. Your brother's still curled on the floor. You sit beside him and share a crust you found, breaking it in half. He chews slowly, and for the first time all day his breathing sounds less ragged. There are no second helpings, no desserts. You go to sleep with your belly half full and call it a good day. This is how you live. You dream not of feasts or full tables, but of an uninterrupted meal. Something hot, something filling, maybe even something sweet. But mostly you just want enough. Enough to get you through another day of chimney dust, factory grime, and the heavy silence of an empty room. Tomorrow it starts again. Wake, work, scavenge, sleep. You don't complain. No one does. Because the only thing worse than eating scraps is eating nothing at all. It's market day. Not the posh kind with bright awnings and fresh-faced vendors smiling over polished apples. This is the back alley, barrel-lid, shout-over-the-din version. You move through the haze of bodies and animal smells, stepping over slush and stray feathers, dodging a sack of offal someone's dropped in the mud. It's chaos, pure and glorious, and if you're clever, or desperate enough, you might come away with something to eat. The Victorian market isn't clean, it's not tidy, it doesn't even try to pretend. It's loud, alive, and faintly hostile. Vendors bellow over each other, hawking fresh meat that's clearly not, vegetables with bite marks from rats, and heaps of yesterday's bread looking like they lost a fistfight with a chimney. There's no refrigeration, no health inspection, and absolutely no guarantees. But for the poor, it's one of the few places where food is available at bargain bin prices, if you've got the stomach for it. You pass a stall selling butcher's bits, scraps swept from the floor of the slaughterhouse. This isn't steak or roast. This is gristle, tendon, fat, and whatever else didn't get scooped into the dog food pile. The vendor swears it's good for soup, and technically, he's not wrong. If you boil it long enough, it becomes soft enough to chew, sort of. Then there's the fruit cart. You spot a pile of apples, all pocked with bruises and suspiciously sticky. The vendor eyes you and leans in. "A penny for 3, he mutters, "but they're all ripe, love." That's code for eat them today or throw them away tomorrow. You hand over the coin. The apples are soft, yes, but they're edible. You bite into one and get a mouthful of sour pulp and grit. There's a worm. You spit, shrug, and keep chewing. Historical fact coming your way. Open-air markets in Victorian cities like London, Manchester and Liverpool were vital hubs for the working poor. Before the rise of supermarkets or even reliable corner shops, these stalls provided the only affordable access to perishable food. Prices dropped rapidly toward the end of the day when vendors wanted to offload goods rather than cart them home. That meant bargain hunters, especially women and children, swarmed the markets at dusk, hoping for a deal on wilted greens or last-minute meat scraps. Now, let's bring in a fringe gem. Victorian market stalls sometimes sold something called blown meat. This isn't a new protein trend. It's meat that had started to rot and was reinflated with air to make it look plump and fresh. Butchers literally inserted a pipe into the meat and puffed it up like a balloon. People bought it. People ate it. People got sick. And then they came back the next week and did it all again. Because sometimes the risk of spoiled food was better than the certainty of none. This brings us to the debate. Did Victorian markets empower the poor by providing cheap food? Or did they exploit desperation by dumping unsafe, low-quality goods onto people with no other options? Some historians argue that markets were grassroots lifelines, a chaotic but essential system of food redistribution. Others see them as symptoms of structural failure. No regulation, no protection, just a swirling pit of inequality dressed up in noise and cheap fish. Back in the present tense, you're clutching your apple cores and looking for something more substantial. A boy is selling what he calls bread and scrape, a slice of brown bread spread with something vaguely white and salty. You know what it is. Probably drippings from yesterday's roast, scraped off a plate in a tavern kitchen and stretched thin across half a loaf. You take one. It tastes like fat, soot, and faintly of regret. But it's warm. It's heavy. You can feel it settle in your gut like a sandbag. The market's winding down now. The fish stall is throwing out heads and tails and you consider diving in. A woman in rags gets to them first. She cackles and holds up a grey fish skull like it's a trophy. You smile despite yourself. Everyone's a scavenger here. Everyone's got a story they won't tell. As you leave, you pass a vendor selling pickled things in jars. Onions, eggs, maybe even a pig's foot if you squint. It's too expensive today, but you make a note. Maybe next week if you get paid. Maybe if that lad from the factory finally gives you back the coin he owes. Maybe if there's no rain and no fines and no one gets sick again. You walk home with your haul, 2 wormy apples, a smear of bread and scrape, and a handful of wilted cabbage leaves you managed to grab when no one was looking. It's not enough for a feast, but it's more than nothing. And tomorrow, maybe the same stalls will have better luck. Maybe a butcher will take pity and toss you a real bone. Maybe. You sit on the stoop of your building, the street lamp flickering above you like a dying firefly, and take one last bite of apple, avoiding the brown spot near the core. Someone passes by with a wheelbarrow full of turnips. You wonder if you could nick one. You don't, not tonight. You've made it this far on honesty and elbows, that'll have to do. The market closes behind you, the sounds fade, the city exhales, and your belly, while not full, is no longer crying. By now you know what hunger tastes like. Metallic, dry, a little like sadness ground into flour. You also know what desperation does to a recipe. It turns scraps into stew and offcuts into dinner. Tonight, you're eating something that both fascinates and unsettles. Meat, sort of. More precisely, you're eating hashed meat, the Victorian catch-all term for, well, let's say mystery protein. When meat is too old to roast and too rough to chew, you hash it. Chop it fine, stew it long, and don't ask too many questions. You're in a narrow kitchen, steam fogging the cracked window, standing over a pot that smells like every meal ever cooked in it, all at once. There's something stringy and dark bubbling inside, mixed with onions, if you had any, gravy made from flour and water, and sometimes coffee grounds for colour, and whatever herbs might have been pinched from the neighbour's yard. The recipe, it changes daily. One day it's mutton, the next it's horse, and sometimes it's nothing you want to name. You don't ask where the meat came from, you just cook it until it stops moving. That's how hashed meat works. It's food by obliteration. Dice it, drown it, disguise it. Add breadcrumbs to stretch it, add vinegar to kill the smell. Serve it hot and fast and pray no one chokes on a shard of bone. Here's your historical fact. Hashed meat was a standard dish in many Victorian homes, especially those with little money and no refrigeration. Leftovers weren't just reheated, they were transformed, disguised, and reused over and over. Meat could be hashed and rehashed across multiple meals, often combined with potatoes, bread, or grains, to give the illusion of quantity. And the Victorian obsession with not wasting a scrap, it ran deep. Cookbooks of the era included entire chapters on how to repurpose meat: cold beef pudding, liver hash, tongue pie, kidney stew, and the delightfully named mock duck, which had no duck in it whatsoever, just soot, sage, breadcrumbs, and imagination. Now for your fringe fact, there were actual vendors who sold pre-hashed meat from barrels. No one ever asked what kind of meat it was. Beef could mean ox, horse, or even old sheep. Some barrels weren't meat at all, just animal fat dyed and seasoned to simulate protein. And yes, sometimes it was rotten, but at least it was cheap. That leads us into the scholarly debate. Were the poor deceived by these food practices, or did they simply participate in a shared act of willful ignorance? Some say working-class Victorians were tricked, sold adulterated food with false labels and dishonest weights. Others suggest they knew exactly what they were eating, but survival outweighed squeamishness. In this world, the real crime wasn't what was in the pot. It was not having a pot at all. Back in your kitchen, the hash is ready. You ladle it onto a tin plate, the kind with a dent in the middle that holds gravy like a moat. It smells surprisingly good. The meat, whatever it is, has been stewed into surrender. You tear off a piece of dry bread and dip it in, soaking up the thick brown sludge with something that resembles gratitude. It's warm, it's heavy, and it doesn't fight back. Others in the room are eating too. Your sister has hers with a spoon she swiped from the inn. Your mother just sips the gravy and saves the solid bits for tomorrow. You all eat in silence, broken only by the occasional clink of tin or slurp of broth. No one asks what it is. That's not how dinner works here. You remember once, when you were younger, asking your father what was in the stew. He just smiled and said, "Wednesday." That's become the family joke now. If someone's chewing and frowns, someone else shrugs and mutters, "Must be Wednesday." It makes you laugh, mostly. But deep down you know the real punchline. Every night is Wednesday when meat comes from a cart that doesn't keep receipts. You finish your plate and feel, not full exactly, but functional. It'll be enough to carry you through tomorrow's labour. You wrap the last bit of bread in cloth and tuck it away for the morning. That, paired with leftover gravy congealed into a jelly, is breakfast. No one calls it by name, it's just what's left. And that's the thing. The Victorians didn't waste, not because they were noble or efficient, but because they couldn't afford to. Food was too scarce, too uncertain. Even the worst cut, the blackest crust, the sourest scrap could be saved, boiled, hashed, or hidden. You learn to cook by learning to stretch, to lie with spices and silence, to make something taste good just long enough for it to disappear. Later that night, you sit by the fire and rub your belly, listening to the distant sound of horses and carts rattling through the wet streets. Someone outside is singing a pub tune, off-key and half forgotten. The warmth from the hash still clings to your chest. Tomorrow you'll look for meat again. Maybe not real meat, maybe not fresh, but something to hash, disguise, and serve with a side of denial. Because in the end, hashed meat is more than a dish. It's a philosophy, a quiet declaration that says, I may not know what this is, but I'm still here to eat it. And that, in this time and place, is enough. It's early evening now and the kitchen smells like steam and something vaguely metallic. You've boiled water in the same pot 4 times this week. Tonight's meal doesn't come in slices or chunks or even identifiable textures. It comes in the shape of pudding, not the kind that jiggles sweetly on a spoon crowned with whipped cream or dusted with sugar. No, this is Victorian pudding, and tonight it's savoury. Solid, dense enough to stop a falling coal in its tracks. And what's inside it? Well, that depends on what didn't go bad yet. You're making something called a plum duff, though there are no plums, and duff is Victorian for whatever the heck we could cram into a cloth bag and steam for 3 hours. The ingredients include a fistful of sweet, a scoop of flour, and a mystery assortment of chopped organs from the butcher's bucket. Maybe some beef lung, maybe liver, possibly a bit of tongue. You don't ask, you don't want to know. You mix it all together, add stale breadcrumbs, tie it in a cloth, and hang it over a boiling pot like it's being executed by steam. Victorian puddings weren't just food, they were strategy. You could feed an entire family with a few scraps if you wrapped them in dough and boiled them long enough. Sweet puddings were for Christmas or weddings. These were survival puddings, gritty, bland, and usually grey. But they were hot, and hot counts for something when the temperature outside has dropped low enough to freeze the inside of your wash basin. Your historical fact: savoury puddings, like steak and kidney pudding, or blood pudding, were common fare in working-class Victorian homes. Puddings allowed frugal cooks to combine flour, fat, and scraps into a cohesive filling dish that could simmer over a fire all day using little more than a rag and a pot of water. Many homes didn't even have ovens, just open hearths or makeshift stoves, so steaming was the preferred method of cooking. Tonight's pudding, though, it's seen better days. You open the cloth to reveal a heavy, glistening lump that smells of boiled iron and regret. You slice into it. Steam hisses out, and the inside looks like meatloaf had a bad dream. You pass slices around on chipped plates. Nobody says anything. Not out loud, anyway. Quirky fact for you. Some Victorians believed that pudding cloths could pass down flavour over time. That's right. Like seasoning a cast iron pan, but with boiled liver and flour. Families had lucky cloths they used for years, soaking up generations of suet, broth and meat juice. A pudding made in a new cloth was considered suspicious. You don't mess with tradition when your meal depends on it not being awful. But there's always a debate under the surface. Were savoury puddings actually enjoyed by the poor, or merely tolerated? Some argue they were a source of pride, especially regional specialties, like black pudding in the north or haggis in Scotland. Others insist they were simply a creative way to disguise how little protein a person was actually consuming. You weren't eating meat, you were eating flavoured filler, and you were lucky if the texture didn't remind you of someone else's discarded laundry. Still, when the pudding is passed to you, you eat. The first bite is always the worst. Too salty, then suddenly bland, with bits that crunch when they probably shouldn't. But it's warm, and the sweat gives it that slippery richness that coats your stomach like a hug from inside. You chew slowly, trying not to think about the tongue that might be in there, or the kidney, or the unexplainable chewiness that doesn't belong to any known cut of meat. Someone asks if there's any mustard. You all laugh. What a dream. You make do with a splash of vinegar which brightens the pudding just enough to let your brain stop protesting. By the second bite, it's almost bearable. By the third, you're hungry enough not to care, and by the time your plate is clean, you feel, not full but less empty. The baby cries in the next room. Your sister carries him over and lets him nibble a softened corner of pudding. He gags a little but swallows it. That's the family verdict. Good enough. You look around the room and take stock of the other faces. Eyes tired, shoulders stooped, bellies less hollow than they were an hour ago. The pudding might not be tasty, or even comforting, but it works. It binds the family together in quiet solidarity. It gives you something to chew, something to focus on, something to call dinner. Later, you scrape the crusty bits from the pudding cloth and save them in a tin for tomorrow's soup. Nothing is wasted. The pot of steaming water is set aside for reuse. Maybe for tea, maybe for washing, maybe for nothing. It doesn't matter. Every part of the process is ritual now. You don't just cook to eat, you cook to stay sane, to keep your hands busy while the world crumbles outside. And as you sit back, the pudding sitting in your gut like a brick wrapped in kindness, you allow yourself a rare moment of stillness. No one's crying. No one's asking for more. No one's talking about the butcher's bill or the rent that's 2 weeks late. Just silence and pudding. And the strange, quiet pride of having made something out of nothing. You're up before dawn again, stomping your feet by the hearth to chase away the cold that's sunk into your bones like it's paying rent. The fire's barely embers, but there's enough heat left to warm yesterday's bread, assuming it hasn't gone rock hard overnight. You reach for the last crust, brush off a layer of ash it collected while sitting too close to the coals, and break it in half. It's coarse, heavy, and tastes faintly of stone. Welcome to the world of the pauper's loaf, a name that sounds almost quaint until you try chewing it without cracking a tooth. In Victorian Britain, bread was the backbone of the working poor's diet. When everything else ran out, meat, potatoes, dignity, there was always bread, but not the fluffy, crusty kind with golden tops and clouds of steam rising when you tear it open. No, the bread you eat is dark, dense, and made with flour that might be half sawdust, half hope. You take a bite. It crumbles unevenly in your mouth, bits of bran sticking in your teeth like little reminders of how far you are from the upper crust. Literally. There's grit in it. You're not sure if it's from the flour or the oven ash, but at this point texture is the least of your worries. Here's your historical fact. The brown loaf, or pauper's loaf, was a government-regulated staple in Victorian workhouses and poor relief centres. It was made of wholemeal or barley flour, often mixed with cheaper fillers like rye, potato flour, or, in the worst cases, chalk, alum, or even ground plaster. Its coarser texture and darker colour were not only cheaper to produce, but also intentionally unappealing, as a moral deterrent against relying on charity. Bread that punishes you for eating it. Classic Victorian charity. You chew slower this time, as if that might make it taste like more. It doesn't. But it does bring back the memory of queuing for it, standing in line outside the local relief office, clutching a cloth sack and hoping to get your share before the tray emptied. Bread wasn't given out like soup. It was measured, counted, rationed like ammunition in a war against hunger. No one ever left with enough, just enough to keep them upright. Now for something weird. In some towns there were actually bread inspectors. That's right. Officials tasked with cutting into loaves and inspecting them for adulterants. Butchers could sell rotting meat. Grocers could stretch milk with chalk water. Yet somehow the bread, despite being one of the worst offenders, got all the attention. Maybe because it was so central, or maybe because a bad loaf meant people started getting sick quietly, without riots or headlines. That leads us into the scholarly debate. Was this bread, hard, dry, and at times barely digestible, an act of neglect or intention? Some historians argue it was simply the best possible result of limited resources and mass poverty. Others see it as deliberate control, making sure the poor were just fed enough to keep working, but never enough to gain strength or organise. The Victorian ideal of moral improvement often started with your stomach. If your bread was unpleasant, maybe you'd work harder to earn better. Either way, you eat it. Because you have to. Because there's nothing else. Sometimes you mash it with hot water and call it bread tea. Sometimes you fry it in leftover fat, hoping the sizzle will cover the dryness. And if you're lucky, really lucky, someone gives you a spoonful of treacle to spread on top. That's a royal feast. Sweetness, even in tiny amounts, hits you like a revelation. Tonight's loaf, though, has no treacle, no butter, just weight. You break off a piece and hand it to your brother, who's too tired to ask if there's anything else. He nibbles at it with dull eyes. Your mother eats hers in silence, every bite slower than the last. It's not just a meal, it's a pause. Bread slows you down, makes you quiet. There's nothing exciting about it. But it keeps your hands busy and your mouth from asking questions. You remember overhearing a woman in the market once, a laundress with arms like tree trunks and a voice like sandpaper. She said, "When I dream of white bread." You ever had that? White as a sheet, soft as a cloud. You barely need teeth. You had nodded. Lied. You've seen white bread, sure, in bakery windows on rich men's plates, but tasted it? Never. Not once. That's the class line drawn in crumbs. White bread was sifted, refined, made of flour that had been cleaned of all its imperfections. It meant money, status, the luxury of digestion without effort. But your bread is the opposite. It has bite, it takes time, and somehow it fills you up just enough to keep moving. Later that night, you toast the last bit of loaf over the flame and eat it slowly, letting it turn to paste in your mouth. It's almost comforting in a way. You've eaten it so many times, it's more muscle memory than meal. You chew like a person who still believes in breakfast. You swallow like someone who doesn't expect lunch. Outside, the street is quiet. Even the dogs are asleep. And in your tiny room, your family sleeps with bellies only half empty for once. The bread might be bitter, it might be dry, but it's here, and that means you've survived another day. It's a cold morning, and there's frost spidering across the inside of the window pane. Not outside, inside. You run a finger along the glass and it leaves a trail through the ice like a snail's path. Your breath fogs up the air in front of your face as you move, stiff-limbed toward the hearth. There's no fire yet, no warmth, just the promise of heat if you can get something lit. Your stomach is empty. Again. But not unfamiliar with it. At this point, it's more companion than complaint. You're used to the hollow ache, used to the way it makes your body feel heavier, slower. But this morning, there's hope. There's beer. Before you laugh, let's clarify. This isn't the kind of beer you sip after work with mates in a cosy pub. It's called small beer, a weak, barely alcoholic brew made for one reason, because the water will kill you faster. The Thames is a soup of industrial runoff and human waste. Wells are unreliable at best and death traps at worst. Tea is expensive, milk even more so. But beer is boiled. That means safer. It also happens to dull the edges of hunger. So yes, beer for breakfast is a thing, and if you're lucky, it might be warm. You pour it into a chipped mug, fizzing just a little, and sip slowly. It tastes like bread, but bitter and flat, slightly sour. There's a comfort in it, though. A thickness that coats your throat, gives your stomach the illusion it's been fed. Paired with a piece of cold bread or leftover pudding, it's practically a 3-course meal. Sort of. Here's your historical fact. Throughout the Victorian period, small beer and ale were standard beverages even for children, especially in poorer households. Not because everyone wanted to raise tiny drunks, but because boiling during brewing made it less dangerous than the average city water supply. In factories and workhouses, small beer was often included in rations, milder than regular beer, but strong enough to have a slight relaxing effect. Particularly helpful when you had 12 hours of hard labour ahead of you. And sometimes beer wasn't even the worst thing offered as a beverage. Gin, notoriously cheap and widely available, became the coping drink of the impoverished. There's even a phrase for it: mother's ruin. You've seen women sipping it from tin flasks at the break of dawn, eyes half-lidded, babies slung on hips. Some people judge, others understand. When food is scarce and pain is constant, a warm burn down the throat feels like mercy. Let's add a strange little twist. In some parts of England, raw eggs were cracked into beer and stirred as a kind of protein-boosting breakfast cocktail. Think of it as the Victorian version of a power smoothie. People swore by it. Eggs in sherry, eggs in stout, eggs in hot milk if they were feeling fancy. Never mind the texture. It was calorie-dense, quick, and required no chewing. If you were sick or too tired to eat, that slimy gulp of egg beer was your multivitamin. And now, the debate. Did the widespread use of alcohol in place of food and water help or harm the poor? It's complicated. On one hand, small beer was a practical solution, a drink that hydrated without poisoning you. On the other, the ubiquity of cheap spirits like gin led to addiction, violence, and social collapse in some communities. Reformers argued that alcohol was the cause of poverty. The poor countered that it was the result. When the world chews you up daily, a liquid buffer between you and your circumstances starts to feel necessary. You sip your small beer and stare into the quiet hearth. The fire's finally caught, sputtering to life with a few sticks and some coal dust pressed into a ball. There's nothing cooking yet, but the heat is a small victory. The bread is stale, but you dip it into the beer and pretend it's soup. It softens just enough to chew. If you close your eyes, you can imagine broth, maybe onion, maybe herbs. The children next door are laughing, high-pitched and sharp like tin whistles, probably playing with crumbs or arguing over who gets the last piece of fried potato. You envy their energy. Maybe it's the beer in your belly, but for the first time today you feel a little less hollow, a little more human. You step outside to find the day's work. The streets are already choked with smoke. Vendors setting up, coalmen shouting. A dog barks at a passing cart. A woman nearby is selling hot drinks from a tin canister. Not tea, herbal decoction, which is code for boiled weeds with a hint of sweetness. if she could afford sugar that week. You consider buying some, but the beer is holding for now, maybe later. By noon, your stomach growls again. But the beer has done its job. It gave you time, energy, something warm to push against the cold from the inside. For the poorest of the poor, small beer isn't a treat or a luxury. It's a placeholder, a strategy, a way to make it through the stretch between not enough and just enough. Later, when you return home, exhausted and covered in soot, someone's left a small bottle on the table. It's gin, not beer. Probably pilfered, probably hidden, probably dangerous. But for a moment it glows in the firelight like a secret you don't want to think about yet. You sip water from a boiled pot instead and let the bitterness of your morning beer linger on your tongue. It wasn't much, but it was something. In this life, that's all you can ask for. The door closes softly behind you as you step out into the fog. You've just cleaned a sitting room that smelled like rosewater and lavender wax, with polished side tables and neat silver trays arranged for a meal you'll never be invited to. You caught a glimpse of the menu as you dusted around it. Veal in aspic, calf's foot jelly, and something called blancmange that looked like dessert but tasted like defeat. These are the meals of the Victorian middle class, straining for elegance, reaching for the aristocratic dream one trembling gelatin mould at a time. You work here, but you do not belong here. You carry the pail, sweep the ashes, scrub the step. You hear the clatter of forks behind closed doors, the rustle of linen napkins and gentle laughter over polished tureens. But when it's time to eat, you're down in the basement, slicing into something cold and jiggling. Leftovers, if they're generous. Gristle and jelly if they're not. Today, it's jelly. Again. Victorian middle-class cuisine is obsessed with form. They want food to look impressive, to hold a shape, to wobble and gleam in the candlelight. It's not about flavour, it's about presentation. The more something resembles a marble sculpture or a funeral centrepiece, the more refined it seems. That's why there are entire cookbooks devoted to jelly, aspic and moulded meat. Calves' feet were boiled down to extract gelatin, then poured over fish, vegetables or shredded meat to suspend them in glossy domes of culinary performance art. Here's your historical fact. Gelatin dishes like calf's foot jelly were wildly popular in the Victorian middle class, especially during the mid to late 1800s. These dishes were considered signs of refinement and domestic accomplishment, particularly for women trying to signal gentility in the home. Preparing jelly was labour-intensive and required patience, so a flawless moulded dish was a badge of social competency, proof that a woman could afford time and servants. You, however, don't get the good bits. You get the runoff, the odd bowl of pale jelly, maybe flavoured with meat stock or lemon if someone was feeling kind. It looks like cloudy glass. It tastes like sadness with a hint of beef. You eat it with a dull spoon, swallowing fast to ignore the slick, unnatural texture sliding over your tongue. It clings to your throat like guilt. Time for a strange little detail. The Victorians believed jelly was medicinal, not just nutritious, but healing. Doctors prescribed it for the weak, the ill and the nervous. A spoonful of jelly could cure melancholy, or so the theory went. It was believed to soothe the digestive organs and strengthen the blood. You're not sure if you believe that. Maybe you'd be less melancholic if someone served you food that didn't tremble like it was afraid of you. The debate? Oh, it's a delicious one. Pun intended. Did these ornate, often flavourless dishes actually represent upward mobility, or were they just edible illusions? Some historians argue they were desperate attempts at mimicry. The rising middle class, eager to distance themselves from the poor, filled their tables with food that looked expensive, even if it was mostly water and gelatin. Others point out the genuine innovation in Victorian kitchens, praising their creativity with limited resources. But then again, when your meat comes floating in a dome and your dessert tastes like boiled cow, maybe it's less refined taste and more performance anxiety. Back in your little corner of the world, you try to appreciate the jelly. It's not bad exactly, just nothing. It has no chew, no crisp, no contrast. It fills your stomach in a slow, sneaky way, like a fog creeping into your bones. It's better than hunger, sure, but it's not joy. Sometimes, if no one's watching, you sneak a smear of mustard or a crack of black pepper onto it, just to feel something. Anything. But mostly, you eat it plain. Because that's what's given. Because leftovers are not for customising. You're lucky they remembered to send anything down at all. You sit on a wooden crate spooning cold jelly from a bowl into your mouth like a tired machine. Around you, other servants eat in silence. One woman has cold beef shreds on dry toast. Another has pickled cabbage and tea made from reused leaves. No one complains. No one compliments the cook. Food is fuel here, not conversation. You eat, and then you clean. Later, when the family's out and you're scrubbing candle wax off the dining room floor, you glance at the crystal dishes drying on the sideboard. They gleam under the gaslight, waiting to be filled again with jelly, cream, and whatever ambition tastes like when you have it set in aspic. You can't help but feel that middle-class food is trying too hard, too perfect, too jellied, as if the people eating it are afraid the world might realise they're only one failed payment away from brown bread and bone tea. By the time you finish for the day, your stomach's mostly quiet. Not satisfied, not nourished, but quiet. You wrap up the last spoonful of jelly in a scrap of wax paper and tuck it into your apron for tomorrow. Maybe it'll firm up more overnight. Maybe it'll be worse. Either way, it's food. Sort of. You close the gate behind you and walk home through the fog, your stomach lined with gelatin, and your mind already wondering what new shape tomorrow's hunger might take. There's no variety down here, only leftovers, and the odd miracle when someone forgets to clear a plate. But that jelly, awful as it was, means you won't fall asleep starving, and in this life, anything you can keep down without gagging is a win. You're back on the street, the cold nipping at your fingertips as you shove them deeper into your sleeves. The factory bell has rung, your shift is done, and your legs carry you toward home with a familiar dragging weariness. But your path takes you past something irresistible, a bakehouse window glowing with the soft orange haze of candlelight. Behind the glass, a woman is arranging loaves on a shelf. Warm, round, golden loaves. You pause, you stare, and that's when you see it. A tray of fresh buns, green-tinted and gleaming faintly under the lamplight. They're oddly beautiful. Too beautiful. And something about that colour doesn't sit right. But here's the catch. They're cheap. The sign says 1 penny each, and that's exactly what you have. Your stomach does a little leap at the sight of food that isn't brown or grey. You hand over your coin, and the woman gives you a bun so light it practically floats in your palm. You take a bite. It's sweet, a little floral. Maybe almond, maybe poison. That's not sarcasm. That's a real question. Because what you just ate might have been laced with something far worse than disappointment. You chew slowly, trying to tell if your tongue is tingling from joy or from arsenic. This is not a rare dilemma. In fact, here's your historical fact. Food adulteration in Victorian England was rampant and mostly unregulated until the late 1800s. Vendors added chalk to bread to whiten it, plastered dust to bulk it up, and alum to keep it from going stale. Red lead was used to colour cheese, copper sulphate gave pickles a fresh green pop, and arsenic, yes, arsenic, was found in everything from sweets to beer. It was cheap, effective, and wildly toxic. The infamous Bradford sweets poisoning of 1858 saw more than 200 people fall ill, and at least 20 die after consuming peppermint candies laced with arsenic. The vendor? He didn't even know he'd purchased the colouring from a supplier who'd confused the powder with gypsum. And the customer? She just wanted something nice for her children. Back to your bun. You swallow and wait. Nothing happens immediately. That's either good news or a very bad prelude. You keep walking, chewing carefully. There's a bitter aftertaste that's not quite right, but it's not exactly wrong either. You tell yourself it's probably just too much almond essence. You ignore the way your lips are going slightly numb. Here's a weird tidbit for you. The Victorians believed bright colours in food were a sign of freshness and quality. So bakers, butchers, and grocers did everything they could to make their wares look vibrant. A grey pork pie? Unappetising. But add a little red lead, and suddenly it gleams like Christmas dinner. Bread looked better white, so they bleached it. Sweets were more appealing when they glowed. If your tongue wasn't stained, were you even enjoying yourself? This leads us into a fiery scholarly debate. Was the lack of food safety in the Victorian era due to ignorance or indifference? Some argue sellers simply didn't know better. Chemicals were being discovered and marketed faster than anyone could regulate them. Others say it was profit-driven apathy. If the customer dies later, it's not your fault. The burden of knowledge was placed on the buyer, not the seller. A sort of eat-at-your-own-risk culinary roulette. You make it home without collapsing, so that's promising. The bun is gone, and your stomach, for once, isn't aching. It might be plotting something sinister, but at least it's quiet. Your mother eyes you warily when she sees the smear of green on your sleeve. "Where do you get that?" she asks. You tell her. She clicks her tongue and mutters about pretty poison and cheap death. She's seen it before. Still, you'd do it again. And because for a moment that bun tasted like celebration. It was sweet. It was soft. It looked like something from another life. A better table. Someone else's kitchen. You don't get food that looks like that very often. Most of what you eat is bland, brown and suspicious for completely different reasons. Later that night, as you sit on your cot and wait to see if your insides rebel, you think about how strange it is to live in a world where food isn't just sustenance, it's a gamble. Every meal comes with a risk, not just of hunger, but of contamination, infection or outright poisoning. And yet, people still eat. They still buy. They still risk it all for a scrap of something that looks beautiful enough to forget the ugliness around them. The truth is, you're not afraid of bad food anymore. You're afraid of no food. If the choice is between starvation and a possibly toxic pastry, well, you've already made your decision. Your stomach made it for you. You lie back, staring at the cracked ceiling, your belly full of danger and a little sugar. Maybe the bun will make you sick. Maybe it won't. But at least for one bite you got to taste something close to luxury. And that's what passes for indulgence in the world you live in. Something pretty enough to kill you. The bell tolls early this morning, louder than usual, and you jolt upright with the kind of panic that only hunger and discipline can teach. It's not the church bell, it's the workhouse meal bell, a sound that doesn't invite you to breakfast so much as command you to line up and be grateful for it. The workhouse isn't home, it isn't even a last resort anymore. It's the resort, the only place left when the rent slips unpaid, when sickness takes the breadwinner, or when your body finally crumples under cold and coinlessness. You shuffle into the canteen with the others, feet dragging against the stone floor, eyes lowered. The room smells like steam, bleach, and boiled despair. The walls are grey. The tables are long. No one talks. You're not here to chat. You're here to receive your assigned portion and not question what it is or where it came from. Today's meal, porridge. Not the creamy kind that warms your soul. This is institutional porridge. Watery, clumpy, and always served one ladle short of satisfaction. You sit, you eat, you do not dawdle, one eye on the overseer at all times. He watches like you might stage a rebellion with your spoon. Here's your historical fact. In Victorian Britain, workhouses were government-run institutions intended to provide relief for the destitute. In exchange for shelter and minimal food, residents were subjected to harsh routines, physical labour, and regimented, monotonous diets. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 made it clear. Conditions were to be made deliberately unpleasant to deter people from relying on aid. And the food? It mirrored that philosophy. Enough to keep you alive, but just barely. Today's porridge is made from Indian meal. Cornmeal, rough ground and bland, sometimes laced with grit from poorly cleaned pots. It's not that it's bad, it's just nothing. It fills your mouth without tasting like much of anything, and it cools too fast. You chew it more out of necessity than desire, each bite another tick of the clock before the next round of labour begins. Now here's a quirky detail. Victorian workhouses actually had meal schedules down to the ounce. Men and women received different rations, as did children and the elderly. Breakfast was often gruel or porridge. Lunch might include boiled meat or suet pudding. Supper usually circled back to bread and broth. Variations existed, but rarely improved anything, and food was never seasoned. Salt was considered an extravagance. Butter? A fantasy. Spices? Witchcraft. You were not here to enjoy. The open debate among historians still simmers like one of those massive soup vats. Were workhouse diets cruel by design, or simply the best that could be offered given population size and budget constraints? One camp argues the harshness was intentional, designed to make the workhouse less appealing than even the worst job. Another group insists that while grim, the food was consistent, and in some cases the only reliable meals many people received all year. Either way, no one left the dining hall singing the praises of the cook. You watch as an old man across the table spoons his porridge with trembling hands. He doesn't speak, doesn't look up. He's been here longer than most, so long he probably dreams in silence. A young boy next to you scratches his wrist nervously as he eyes the last bit in his bowl. You push your plate slightly in his direction. He hesitates, then takes it. Hunger always finds its voice eventually. Lunchtime isn't much different. Boiled meat, they call it. It's grey, fibrous, and wrapped in what might be called skin but looks more like regret. It's accompanied by something posing as vegetables, mostly turnips, watery and bitter, barely warm. The whole thing floats in a puddle of greasy liquid too thin to be soup and too thick to be nothing. You eat all of it. The meat's chewy. You chew with your molars and try not to think about what animal it came from, or how long it was hanging in the pantry before it reached your plate. Workhouse meat doesn't come from the butcher's best cuts. It comes from places on the animal you'd rather not identify. Tendons, glands, bits the dogs might reject. You finish your tray in silence, wipe your mouth with your sleeve and stack the tin at the end of the table. Dinner will be the same as supper was yesterday and the day before. Bread. Maybe broth. Sometimes they'll hand out cheese, but don't get excited. It's the crumbly, sour kind, yellowed at the edges and never enough to spread. Just another hard rectangle of barely nourishment. The workhouse dining room has rules. No talking, no sharing, no smiling. You sit, you eat, you leave. Meals are timed and portioned with military precision. And if you ask for more, well, you've heard what happened to the last lad who did that. There was yelling, a beating, then reassignment to stone-breaking duty. Not worth it. By the time supper rolls around, you already know what to expect. Your stomach has learned the rhythm. Hunger, briefly muted, then rising again. You dip your bread in the broth, soak it until it softens, and swallow. It hits the same place it always does. Low in your gut, heavy as guilt. You stare at the crust and wonder if this is what the rest of your life looks like. Eating just enough to keep going, never enough to feel full. But there's a strange comfort in the routine. You know what's coming. You know the taste, the texture, the portion size. You can count on it. It won't change. You won't be poisoned by arsenic or tricked by a green bun. There's no excitement, but there's no danger either. You lie in your cot that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of the others. Your stomach grumbles softly but not with panic, just with habit. And you think, maybe tomorrow someone will drop a slice of apple in your porridge. Maybe the cook will add a pinch of salt. Maybe the broth will have a whisper of meat in it. Or maybe it won't. Maybe the workhouse bell will ring and everything will be the same again. But you'll rise, line up, and eat. Because eating, no matter how miserable, is survival. The vinegar stings your nose before you even step through the doorway. It clings to the air like a warning, sharp, acidic, and persistent. You're in a tiny backroom kitchen now, cramped between a wall of soot-black pots and a shelf stacked with jars of preserved everything. Pickled onions, pickled cabbage, pickled eggs floating like pale ghosts in cloudy brine. It smells like someone tried to preserve the entire month of February in a jar, and then opened it on a hot day. But this isn't a curiosity shop or an apothecary, it's someone's pantry. And tonight, pickled is the only flavour on the menu. Pickling wasn't just a preference in the Victorian era, it was a necessity. Without refrigerators, food had to be preserved somehow, and vinegar became the go-to weapon against spoilage. It was cheap, aggressive, and versatile. You could drown almost anything in it: vegetables, meat, fish, even fruit. And if you got the brine strong enough, it might last for weeks. Or at least until the taste of vinegar drowned out the taste of decay, which to be honest wasn't always a given. Tonight your family's dinner is cold pickled cabbage and a few slices of tough-corned beef, if it can still be called that. The beef is hard around the edges and smells faintly like rusted metal. You slice it thin, trying to convince yourself that the less you chew, the less you'll notice how dry it is. The cabbage is soggy and fluorescent in its own way. Its tang makes your jaw lock and your eyes water. But it's food. It's preserved. And preserved food doesn't get mouldy in the cupboard while you pray for payday. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-19th century, nearly every working-class household had some form of home pickling operation. Industrialised food preservation was still in its infancy, so families relied on salt and vinegar to keep food edible. Cabbage, onions and gherkins were common, but so were less appealing options. Pig's feet, eels, boiled carrots, even eggs that had seen far better days. What makes this even more impressive, or depressing, is the sheer dedication required. You didn't just toss your food into a jar and forget about it. You had to sterilise your glass, if you even had any. Mix the brine, boil it, cool it, and hope you'd measured things correctly. Too little vinegar? Your onions rot. Too much salt? You might as well chew a brick, and heaven help you if someone dropped a dirty spoon in the jar. That one mistake could turn next month's rations into a petri dish. Here's something odd. Victorians pickled fruit too, not just for sweetness, but for sourness. Green walnuts, gooseberries, unripe plums, all pickled. A spoonful of sharp preserved fruit on the side of a fatty meal was seen as both elegant and practical. You've never had pickled cherries yourself, but you've read about them. They're supposedly sweet and sour, which seems impossible and a little suspicious. But then again, if you've eaten cold tripe with malt vinegar, your bar for normal has already gone out the window. The debate? It simmers like brine on the back of the stove. Were pickled foods a sign of resilience and ingenuity, or just another way the poor were forced to cope with unreliable access to freshness? On one hand, preserving meant independence. You didn't have to rely on daily shopping trips or fickle vendors. On the other, it was more evidence that you couldn't afford better. While the middle class dined on fresh meats and oven-roasted vegetables, you were crunching through something that had been submerged in acid for a week and still had the nerve to call itself dinner. You take a bite of the cabbage and chase it with a sip of water. The vinegar burns a little as it slides down. There's no sweetness to this meal, no softness. It's a flavour that demands attention, whether you want it or not. But it fills the hole, and it gives you the illusion of something prepared, something controlled. When your world is chaos, when the wind howls through the cracks in the wall, and your wages shrink by the day, it's nice to open a jar and find something still waiting for you inside. Later you'll scrape the last pickled bits from the bottom of the crock and fold them into a mash of potatoes for tomorrow's lunch. That's the other benefit of pickled food. It's not just edible, it's stretchable. A little goes a long way. A single onion can last a week if you slice it thin and ration it like treasure. The vinegar does more than preserve. It deceives. It makes your scraps taste intentional, like a recipe instead of a rescue. You think of the women who taught you to pickle, your grandmother hunched and vinegar splashed, elbows deep in jars and muttering about ratios. She never measured, she just knew. You watched her pluck a rotten spot off a turnip, trim a layer of skin, and dunk the rest into brine without flinching. Waste not, she said, because the shopman won't give you back your shillings for a soft spot. And she was right. No refunds, no replacements. Just your own 2 hands and a jar of vinegar that smells like punishment. By the time the meal is over, the table is clean, but your tongue is still buzzing. It'll take hours to fade, maybe longer. Your stomach's warm and a little queasy, but it's not empty. And that's enough. You wipe your mouth, wash the plates with lukewarm water, and check the pickling jars. One's still sealed. That'll be for Sunday. You smile, not because it's delicious, but because it exists. In this life, that counts for something. You wake to a strange smell. Sweet, sharp, unfamiliar. It curls through the narrow alley outside your window, past the coal smoke and damp brick, and for a moment your senses twitch with hope. Sugar? Spices? Something toasted? That can't be right. You sit up and sniff again. It's real, definitely not pickled. You stumble to the door, rub the sleep from your eyes and lean out into the street, following the scent like a starving dog. It's coming from 2 doors down, the old widow's place. You weren't expecting luxury on a Tuesday morning, but that smell, that's imported. In the Victorian world, food from the colonies, the far reaches of the British Empire, wasn't just exotic, it was status. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from India and China, spices from Ceylon, coffee from Africa, these weren't just ingredients, they were power. If your kitchen had cinnamon, you weren't poor. If your pantry held real cane sugar, you probably had servants. These goods floated into British ports by the ton, but they didn't float into your cupboard, not unless you stole them, or scrounged, or worked for a family rich enough to leave scraps behind. Today's historical fact. While Britain imported massive quantities of colonial foodstuffs in the 19th century, the poorest classes saw little to none of it. Sugar, for example, became affordable enough that it trickled into working-class kitchens in small amounts, mostly in molasses or coarse brown scrap sugar. But spices, tea, coffee and cocoa were largely reserved for those with disposable income. Even when prices dropped, they were considered indulgences. For most, a cup of tea wasn't a daily ritual. It was a once-a-week miracle. That scent. Turns out it's molasses cake. The widow had a lodger, someone who works the docks, and he brought home a heel of dark, sticky molasses bread. She mixed it with flour, lard and stale breadcrumbs, and baked it in a soot-blackened tin over the fire. The result? A cake that smells like gingerbread and survival. You don't get a piece, but you stand outside long enough to taste it in the air. Molasses is as close to sugar as most people let you get. It's the dark, sticky runoff from the sugar refining process. Cheap, pungent and more bitter than sweet. But it's versatile. You've had it spooned into porridge, smeared on toast and stirred into boiled water to make tea when the real thing's gone. It doesn't take much, just a dab on the tongue. And suddenly the day feels half a shade brighter. And the quirk of the day? Victorian street vendors sold tiny paper cones filled with molasses for children. They called them stickies. Kids would suck on them for hours, letting the sugar coat their teeth like syrupy armour. It wasn't nutritious. It certainly wasn't clean. But it was a treat. And in a world where most desserts involved bread dipped in milk and prayers, a sticky cone was the closest thing to happiness money could buy. But the bigger issue, the scholarly debate still simmering. Did colonial goods widen the class divide in Victorian Britain, or bridge it? On one hand, yes, sugar and tea eventually became cheap enough that even the poor could access them in small doses. On the other hand, the culture surrounding these items, afternoon tea, sugar-dusted pastries, cinnamon-spiced puddings, was built around exclusion. You could buy molasses, sure, but you couldn't buy a spot at the table where sugar loaves were shaved with silver tongs. Still, you remember the first time you tasted real tea. You were 6. A kitchen maid let you sip the last dregs from her cup. It was cold and bitter, but it was tea. Real tea. Your mother scolded you for begging, but you couldn't stop talking about it for days. Now, when you drink your weak brew made from dried blackberry leaves and hot water, you pretend. Pretend it's awesome. Pretend you're in a parlour. Pretend you're holding a cup that isn't cracked. Tonight, after supper, just bread and dripping, nothing fancy. You open the cupboard and stare at your tin of molasses. It's almost empty. One last spoonful. You dip your finger in and taste it slowly, letting it sit on your tongue like a secret. It's strong, almost burnt. It clings to your teeth and the roof of your mouth, but it feels like luxury. You close your eyes and imagine being the kind of person who can afford to waste sugar. Who uses cinnamon in stew and cloves in pudding? Who buys oranges not for scurvy but for show? You tuck the tin away, scrape the last from the spoon, and settle down beside the hearth. Someone's left a piece of dried lemon peel on the windowsill to keep the mice away. You take a sniff. It smells like spice, faint and far away. Like someone else's kitchen. You dream that night of cakes heavy with brown sugar, of cups brimming with sweetened tea, of biscuits that melt on the tongue. But in the morning you'll wake to hard bread and boiled roots. Still, for a few minutes, your dreams taste imported. You step off the curb and into the fog, the kind that hangs like a wet sheet across your face and turns every lantern into a dripping star. Your stomach lurches, not from hunger this time, but from a daring idea, eating out. Not at a proper restaurant, of course. You're not royalty, but maybe a chop house or a cook shop. Somewhere with walls, tables and hot food that didn't come out of your own blackened pot. It feels like playing dress-up with pennies. You rub 2 together in your pocket like flint hoping to spark fire. You've passed this particular chop house a dozen times. The windows are streaked with grease, and the sign hangs askew reading Meals 2D in faded white paint. It's cheap, that's the draw. You step inside. The smell hits first. Meat, old ale, fried onions, and something vaguely fishy lingering under it all. It's warm at least. That counts for something. There's a long wooden counter up front, and a woman with flour on her apron and contempt in her eyes takes your coin without blinking. You're handed a plate with something that vaguely resembles meat. Maybe pork, maybe mutton. It's been chopped, fried, or possibly just seared by accident. On the side is a puddle of what they're calling gravy, and a lump of mashed potatoes so stiff it's holding its shape like it's auditioning for sculpture class. You sit at a sticky table, surrounded by men in soot-streaked coats, their hats off, but their manners left at the door. Here's your historical fact. Chop houses and cook shops were the most affordable dining options for Victorian workers who didn't have access to a kitchen or the time to use one. They offered hearty, no-frills meals like boiled beef and potatoes, suet puddings, pies and fried chops, all for a few pennies. But they were also notoriously inconsistent. Sanitation was optional, menus were suggestions, and freshness often depended on how sharp your sense of smell was. You take a bite, it's not terrible, it's just confounding. The meat is tough, stringy, and spiced with something you can't place. Pepper, coal dust, desperation. The gravy helps it slide down, though it tastes like watered-down beef stock with a hint of flour and regret. The potatoes are cold in the middle, but they're potatoes. Solid, filling. You chew slowly, glancing around to see who else is dining here. There's an old sailor with a pipe clenched between his gums, nodding off between bites. A washerwoman hunched over her meal like she's trying to disappear into it. 2 boys no older than 12 sharing a pie with their bare hands. No one talks. There's a rhythm to the silence, just chewing, swallowing, sighing, the sound of tired bodies accepting tired food. Here's something strange for you. Many of these establishments didn't actually own cutlery. You were expected to bring your own spoon and knife. Forgot yours? Eat with your fingers, or borrow from a stranger. Risky business, considering the state of Victorian hygiene. Salt was kept in crusted communal bowls. Pepper came from tins passed between tables. You didn't order here. You received whatever was cooking, whatever had survived the day, whatever hadn't yet walked off the shelf on its own. Now, the debate. Did these cheap eateries democratise food, or exploit the desperation of the urban poor? Some historians argue that they offered essential nourishment to those working long hours, without a home base to return to. Others see them as early fast food traps, selling barely edible meals at just high enough a price to drain your wages while keeping you coming back. You left full, yes, but rarely satisfied, and never with change in your pocket. You scrape up the last of the potatoes and mop up the gravy with the heel of bread included with your meal. It's dry and full of holes, but it's still bread. You feel it settle in your stomach with the weight of something earned. You glance at your empty plate and think, at least I didn't cook it. That's worth a penny or two, right? Before you leave, you take a look at the chalkboard near the back. Tomorrow's offerings: beef hash, onion stew, eel pie. You might come back, or you might not. Depends on the coins. Depends on how your gut handles the mystery meat over the next 12 hours. You once heard of a man who ate a bad chop and died 2 days later from internal putrefaction. The term still haunts you. But so does hunger. Outside, the cold hits you like a slap. Your breath fogs the air again. The heat from the cook shop disappears the moment the door swings shut behind you. But you walk a little straighter. You've eaten. Your stomach is quiet. That alone makes you luckier than half the city tonight. You pass a bakery with cakes in the window. Of course you stop. The display is for rich mouths, rich eyes, rich children with clean mittens and sticky fingers. You look, then you move on. You've had your meal. It was ugly and it was anonymous, but it didn't try to be anything else. For now, that's enough. You make it home just as the rain starts. You shake off your coat, sit by the fire and think about the chop house. The clatter, the smell, the taste. Not a feast, not even comfort. But for a brief fleeting hour you were a customer, not just a cook, a beggar or a mouth waiting to be filled. You had a seat at a table, and that's a different kind of full. It's after dark, and the house has gone quiet, save for the occasional creak from the floorboards above, or the low hiss from the hearth where embers whisper themselves into ash. You're still in the scullery, sleeves rolled up, hands raw from soap and scrubbing. The family you serve has gone upstairs. Dinner is over. The plates have been cleared, the crumbs swept into a silver pan and tossed without thought. The roast was half carved, the pudding barely touched. You watched the whole thing from the edge of the room, invisible in plain sight. And now, finally, you're alone in the kitchen, surrounded by leftovers no one will claim. This is your moment. Not a break exactly, but a chance to forage through what remains and see if you can feed yourself without raising suspicion. Because being a servant in Victorian England means knowing how to eat without leaving evidence. Tonight you spot a sliver of cold beef still stuck to a carving board, half a spoonful of dripping in the corner of a dish, and the faintest smear of jam clinging to the rim of an abandoned tart tin. You work quickly and quietly. The beef goes into your mouth first, chewed fast before anyone hears you. The dripping? You scoop it onto the edge of a heel of bread that's too stale to serve but perfect for you. The jam? You scrape it off with your finger and lick it clean. It tastes like stolen summer. Here's your historical fact. Many Victorian servants survived on leftovers, while some wealthier employers offered formal servant meals, usually plain but adequate. Many lower-ranking workers, especially scullery maids, errand boys and charwomen, were expected to help themselves to what was left. There were rules, of course, unspoken ones. You could eat scraps, but only if you didn't leave a trace. You could nibble crusts, but woe to you if anyone noticed the filling gone. This is what makes it a game of precision. You don't take a whole slice of pudding. You skim the edge, balance the flavours, redistribute the crumbs. Your success isn't measured in fullness, but in how little evidence remains. The goal isn't just eating, it's not getting caught. Tonight you feel lucky. The roast had a bone that no one touched. Still plenty of flavour left. You suck on it when you're back in your room, savouring every last bit of gristle like a fine delicacy. You remember once when the housekeeper caught you with a piece of cold sausage and didn't say a word, just raised her eyebrow and let you sweat for a week. You didn't eat meat again for a month after that, just out of caution. Here's a weird one. Some servants, particularly kitchen boys, developed complex systems of pre-tasting food. A bit of stew, a few peas, a lick of the custard spoon. Just to make sure it wasn't poisoned, of course. At least that's what they claimed. The line between duty and hunger got blurry when the meat was hot and the cook wasn't looking. The debate among historians is oddly divided. Some say these quiet thefts were tolerated, an unspoken agreement between masters and servants. Others argue that employers saw even the smallest bite as moral failure, a betrayal of the servant's supposed purity and self-restraint. One lad caught sneaking a crust could be dismissed on the spot. Another might get a wink and a slice wrapped in a cloth. It all depended on the mood of the house. You've learned to read moods like a barometer. You know when the mistress is feeling generous. She leaves the kitchen early and doesn't check the pantry. You know when the cook is distracted, usually after 2 glasses of wine. You know how to scrape fat off a plate with the backside of a spoon so the pattern underneath stays clean. You've turned the act of eating into a performance of absence. Sometimes, if there's too much left over and no one's watching, you wrap something in paper and tuck it under your apron. Maybe a biscuit, maybe a sliver of cold pie. You bring it home and share it with your siblings, who look at you like you've just returned from a foreign land bearing gold. "Is that fruit?" they whisper. "Real fruit?" "Yes." You nod. Peaches even. Cold and syrupy. The kind of thing no one in your street ever sees unless they're carrying it to someone else's table. And this really is the heart of it. The food isn't just food, it's proximity to another life. You eat their scraps and taste for one fleeting moment what it feels like to be well fed. Not just filled, but indulged. Even if it's second-hand, even if it's shameful. You feel like a ghost haunting the edge of luxury. Tonight, as you scrape the last bits into your mouth and rinse the dishes under lukewarm water, you think about the meals you've served. The cutlery, the laughter, the sound of wine glasses clinking. You don't envy them, not exactly. But you wonder what it would be like to eat first. To eat openly. You dry your hands on your apron and tuck away the last bit of crust in your pocket. It's not much, but it'll taste better when no one's around. That's the thing about servant meals. They're eaten standing, in silence, in the shadows. But even that feels better than nothing. You climb the back stair, bones aching, stomach just shy of empty. Tomorrow maybe the roast will have more fat. Maybe the tart won't be finished. Maybe the mistress will forget to check the silver tray before it's cleared. You don't ask for a feast, just a scrap. Something sweet, something secret. It's midweek and the rain is relentless, sliding down rooftops in crooked streams, soaking into the street muck until everything smells like ash, rotted leaves, and wet brick. You've got 2 hours before the next shift at the mill, and your belly's been making noises so loud it's practically conducting its own symphony. But you've got an idea. An old one, picked up from a girl who used to work beside you before she disappeared without warning. She called it a diet trick, though she said it with a grim little smirk that made you think the word trick was doing most of the work. Time to try a Victorian health fad. What could go wrong? You reach into your coat pocket and pull out a half-filled bottle of something dark and sharp-smelling. Vinegar. Plain malt, the cheap kind, the kind that burns your throat and makes your mouth pucker like it's been slapped. You take a swig. It hits hard. Your nose tingles, your eyes water, but your stomach stops growling, at least for a moment. That's the trick, apparently. It numbs the hunger. It's not nutrition, it's just a distraction. Vinegar diets were all the rage in certain Victorian circles, though they took very different shapes depending on which side of the social divide you stood on. The poor drank it because it was cheap, available, and, most importantly, it made them feel just full enough to keep going. The rich, they drank it because Lord Byron did. And that's your historical fact. The vinegar diet was popularised by Lord Byron in the early 19th century, who claimed it helped maintain his famously thin frame. He'd reportedly drink water laced with vinegar and eat only dry biscuits or boiled vegetables. His devoted fans, mostly upper-class women desperate to emulate his pallid elegance, followed suit, often to the point of fainting. Meanwhile, poor women discovered the same effect quite by accident. When your food runs out, vinegar tricks the stomach into thinking there's something in it. You chase the vinegar with a crust of stale bread that tastes like old cardboard and vinegar. Surprise, but at least it gives your teeth something to do. Next to you, a woman takes a raw egg, cracks it into a chipped teacup and slurps it down in one gulp. She wipes her mouth and mutters, "Keeps the skin clear." You've heard that one before too. Let's call that your fringe fact for the day. One particularly strange Victorian health fad involved mixing raw eggs into alcoholic drinks, usually sherry, brandy or port, as a form of tonic. Raw eggs in wine weren't just seen as nourishing, they were believed to cure everything from melancholy to muscle fatigue. This egg flip, or egg posset, was especially recommended for women and invalids. Of course, whether it helped anything is still up for debate. Mostly it just slid down your throat and sat in your stomach like a warm question mark. You're not quite ready for the egg. But you've heard of other tricks too. Some girls chew paper, some chew rags dipped in vinegar, some smoke when they can get a pinch of tobacco. Not because they like it, but because it blunts the edge of emptiness. You once tried filling your stomach with hot water, pretending it was broth. It worked until you had to stand for hours, stomach sloshing, limbs going numb. The real debate, the one that doesn't make it into polite conversation, is whether these diets were really about health, or just survival disguised as fashion. Historians argue over it. Some say the working poor took cues from the elite, chasing thinness because society equated it with virtue. Others argue it was the other way around. The elite romanticised starvation because they didn't have to live it. Whatever the case, when your ribs show through your shirt, no one asks whether it's a diet or a disaster. They just avert their eyes. You look down at your hands, thin, calloused, dry. You take another swig of vinegar. This one's worse than the last. Your stomach tightens, but again, the growling stops. A small mercy. You keep the bottle with you, tucked into your apron, like a secret. A meal in a bottle, even if it's more fiction than fact. You make it to the mill just as the horn sounds. Your breath still smells sharp. Your mouth feels like it's been scrubbed with lemon rind. But you're upright, you're working, and no one can see the hunger inside you flinching like a kicked dog. At break time, one of the girls offers you a bite of something wrapped in paper. "It's potato," she says, "and a bit of lard." You smile and decline. Not because you're not hungry, but because it's easier to pretend you're not. If you start eating now, you might not stop, and you need this trick to last till sundown. By the time you walk home, the vinegar's worn off, your stomach's roaring again, you scrape together a bowl of something warm, onion water maybe, or bread mashed into hot milk if you can spare a splash. But you still take one last sip from the bottle, not because it helps anymore, but because now it's a ritual. And rituals, even ridiculous ones, keep you sane. Before bed, you brush your teeth with a piece of cloth and cold water. You can still taste vinegar. You wonder what Lord Byron would think of you. Probably nothing. He never missed a meal a day in his life. But you sleep with a quieter belly, and that's the point. You've dieted today. Not for vanity, not for trend, but for survival. The rain has stopped by morning, but the world is still soaked through. You can hear the soft squelch of boots in the street, and the drip, drip, drip from the eaves above your window. You sit by the stove with your hands wrapped around a tin mug. Not tea, not broth, not even beer this time. Just warm water again. Your breath curls up in little ghost puffs as you sip and try not to think about food yet. It's Sunday. That means dinner. Real dinner. Or at least, the closest thing you're likely to see all week. The Sunday dinner is a sacred institution in Victorian working class life. It may be the only hot meal you eat that involves actual meat, or something meat-like. The rest of the week is crusts and broth, stale pudding and vinegar tricks. But Sunday means effort. A roast if you can get it, or a stew. or at least something boiled until it pretends to be rich. You've managed to pool together ingredients: 2 turnips, a carrot, a lump of dripping from the workhouse kitchen, and, miracle of miracles, a bone with a sliver of meat still clinging to it. It's already browning in a pot, sizzling gently and fat scraped off yesterday's griddle. The smell draws the neighbours to your door, not in complaint, in curiosity. A good Sunday meal is like a weather event. It makes people lean in. Here's your historical fact. Sunday dinner was often the highlight of the week for working-class Victorians. Many families saved all their fuel and best ingredients for that single meal. It was a tradition built not on luxury but on ritual, a roast, when possible. Vegetables, gravy and a pudding. Sometimes, if the family was religious, the meal would follow church service. Other times, it was the church service. Food as ceremony, a shared meal as proof of survival. Your broth simmers low and slow, filling the room with steam. The vegetables break down, the flavours mingle, and that single scrap of meat does the heavy lifting. You've thickened it with flour, added a touch of mustard powder, and just to show off, dropped in a bay leaf someone gave you for Christmas. It's probably more sentiment than flavour now, but it makes you feel accomplished. And here's a quirky addition: spotted dick. Yes, that's a real thing, and no, the Victorians weren't being cheeky on purpose, at least not officially. Spotted dick is a sweat pudding, usually steamed, studded with dried fruits, the spots, and served with custard if you're lucky, or treacle if you're not. You don't have any dried fruit, but you do have some old bread and a spoon of sugar. That's enough to fake something dessert adjacent. You'll call it pudding, no one will argue. The big debate, one still murmured in old kitchens and books on domestic life, is whether the Sunday dinner brought people together or highlighted how little they had. Some scholars say it fostered community, a sense of hope and rhythm. Others argue it reinforced the brutal contrast between the feast and the famine, the one good meal setting the rest of the week into sharper, more painful relief. After all, what's more cruel than a good memory when you know you can't repeat it for another 6 days? You call everyone to the table. 4 people, 1 table, no matching chairs. Your sister lights the candle, half for ceremony, half because it's too dark to see the food otherwise. The soup is ladled into chipped bowls. It's more gravy than broth now, thick with softened vegetables and little strands of meat that cling together like they're grateful to have survived. There's bread, dry but present, and the pudding, lumpy and dense, sits in the centre like a prize. You eat slowly, deliberately. No one talks for the first few minutes. It's not just manners, it's reverence. You all know this is rare. You chew with intention, with your eyes closed, letting the salt and heat wake up parts of your tongue that haven't seen seasoning in weeks. Even the bread seems special, dipped in this broth, softened just enough to resemble something prepared on purpose. Halfway through the meal, someone laughs. It's not at anything, just the kind of laugh that bubbles up when the belly stops hurting and the shoulders unclench. The candle flickers, the rain taps faintly on the glass, and for a moment this kitchen, cramped, cold, cracked, feels like a dining room in a grand house. Or close enough. You finish every bite, no crumbs left. Even the bay leaf is chewed thoughtfully before being set aside. The pudding is passed around, cut into hunks with a blunt knife, and swallowed like treasure. It's not sweet, but it's solid. That's enough. The warm weight in your stomach feels like protection, like armour, like you might survive the rest of the week on this one good meal alone. Afterward, you wash the dishes with lukewarm water and hang the pot to dry. You pack the leftover crusts, if there are any, for someone's breakfast. You store the broth fat in a jar for Wednesday's gruel. Nothing gets wasted. The Sunday dinner gives birth to a dozen lesser meals. It lives on, quietly, in Monday's stew, Tuesday's sandwich, Thursday's soup. And later that night, as you lie in bed with the smell of cooked onions still clinging to your shirt, you replay the meal in your mind. Not just the taste, but the moment. Everyone around the table, everyone chewing, everyone breathing easy for a little while. You think, maybe next week you'll have a bit more dripping, maybe 2 bones, maybe a real pudding with raisins. It's not much of a dream, but it's yours. You're standing in the queue at the butcher's, and you can already tell today's haul won't be good. The smell hits before you're even inside. Sour, slightly metallic, with a hint of something sweet that shouldn't be sweet. Rot, maybe. Or bleach. Or both. You glance at the other faces in line. No one looks surprised, just resigned. You're all here for the same thing, meat that shouldn't be meat anymore, marked down for those desperate enough to take it home and pretend it's still food. There's a woman near the front arguing about a slab of pork that's turning green around the edges. It's still good, the butcher insists, flapping a stained rag toward the meat, like he can scare the decay away. She narrows her eyes, shrugs, and buys it. That's how this works. If it's not crawling, it's cooking. You're hoping for something usable. Ox cheek, pig liver, maybe a few kidneys. You're not picky. You just need something that, once boiled and chopped and stewed within an inch of its life, might pretend to be edible. It doesn't need to taste good. It just has to not kill anyone. Today's historical fact. Victorian meat markets were often filled with cuts that were either long past fresh or, quite frankly, never intended for humans to eat in the first place. Offal, organs, entrails and undesirable parts were the foundation of the working poor's protein, but even that came with risk. Meat spoilage was common, and without refrigeration, butchers relied on dyes, spices and sheer nerve to keep their products looking appealing. Some meat was painted with red lead to restore its colour. Others were dusted with pepper or smoked over straw to cover the scent of decay. You finally reach the counter and point to what looks like beef. At least it's red. The butcher gives you a half smile, shrugs like he's doing you a favour and slaps it onto the scale. It's heavy and still slightly sticky, and you try not to breathe too deeply as you wrap it in newspaper. It'll need hours in the pot. You pray the smell doesn't get worse with heat. And here's your fringe fact of the night. There was an entire underground trade in Victorian Britain devoted to reviving spoiled meat. Rogue butchers and street vendors would soak rotten cuts in chemicals, borax, alum, even arsenic, to kill the odour and firm up the flesh. It didn't fix the meat. It just gave it a brief second life, a cosmetic resurrection. Enough to pass as edible under the right light, or to fool a nose gone numb from years of coal smoke and compromise. Historians still argue over how widespread this was. Some insist it was a few bad apples, a handful of corrupt dealers pushing poisoned meat to the poorest. Others believe it was rampant, normalised, and even understood by the buyers. After all, if the choice was between tainted meat and no meat, most people rolled the dice. You can't get fussy when your ribs show through your shirt. You carry your parcel home with both hands, careful not to let the juices soak through. The paper's already going soft. Once inside, you set the meat on the cutting board and inspect it closer. It's red, yes, but too shiny. Artificial looking. The fat is grey and slimy at the edges. You scrape it clean with a dull knife, trim off the worst parts, and toss them to the side. You boil a pot of water and drop in the scraps first, testing the smell. Not awful, not good either. You drop in the rest. You drown it in onions and vinegar. Add herbs if you have any left. A pinch of salt. A spoonful of flour to thicken. Anything to cover what it really is. A near corpse of an animal, resurrected for one last meal. You stir, taste, adjust. You'll boil it for hours. You'll boil the memory out of it. When it's done, it looks like stew. It even smells decent. Onions can work miracles. You ladle it into bowls thick and hot and brown. Everyone eats. No one speaks. There's a tiny bit of gristle, a strange aftertaste that lingers on the tongue, but no one mentions it. If your stomach holds, you won't ask questions. If you wake up tomorrow without fever or cramps, you'll call it a success. You watch the others eat, cheeks sunken, eyes hopeful. The baby is chewing on a piece of carrot soaked in broth, oblivious. Your brother dips bread into his bowl, careful not to waste a drop. Your mother swallows without chewing, eyes closed, hands folded tight. Everyone knows what this meat might be. No one wants to say it. Afterward, you scrub the pot and let it dry. You wrap the leftovers in a clean cloth and set them on the sill. You check your belly, wait for the grumble or the churn. Nothing yet. That's good. You lie down near the fire and listen to the wind outside, and you think, maybe it was safe. Maybe that red wasn't dye. Maybe this time the butcher told the truth. But part of you wonders what happens when meat forgets it was ever meat to begin with. What does it mean when your food fights you from the inside out? You fall asleep with a belly full and your fingers crossed. That's dinner in your world, survival, dressed up as stew. The wind howls against the window panes tonight, rattling them in their frames like bones in a tin drum. You lie still in bed, wrapped in every scrap of blanket and coat you own, but the cold pushes through anyway. An uninvited guest crawling beneath your skin. The fire's gone out. There's no more coal, no more wood either. and your stomach is whispering threats, curling in on itself with a hollow ache you've learned to ignore in daylight, but which, in the dark, grows bold. You can't sleep like this. Hunger is louder than the wind. You need something, anything. So you get up, barefoot on cold floorboards, stepping lightly so you don't wake the baby or set the dog barking next door. You head to the kitchen, if you can call it that. A small room with a table and a stove that looks better than it works. There's a cupboard in the corner where you keep the emergency stash. You open it slowly, reverently. Inside there's the heel of a loaf. Not fresh, not even soft. But it's bread, and tonight, bread is life. You break it open, but as you do, you see it. Sand. Not much, but unmistakable. Fine grit mixed into the crumb, clinging to the edge like it was baked with beach dust. You brush it off with your sleeve and bite anyway. It crunches between your teeth like gravel. It's not pleasant, but it's something. You chew slowly, feeling each grain of adulterated flour wear down your molars like time itself. Here's your historical fact. Victorian bread, especially the loaves sold to the poor, was frequently adulterated with fillers like chalk, plaster of Paris, alum, and yes, sand. Bakers were under immense pressure to sell cheaper loaves while maintaining the illusion of substance. Wheat flour was expensive, and adding filler bulked up the bread without raising the price. Of course, it also ruined your teeth, shredded your insides, and occasionally killed people. But in the short term, it filled bellies. Sort of. You add a little water to soften the next bite. It helps. Sort of. You pull out a pot and pour in the last of yesterday's potato water, the cloudy liquid left over from boiling skins and scraps, and stir in some stale bread bits to make a sort of mush. You warm it over the stove, stirring slowly, letting the heat coax a little softness into the mixture. It smells faintly of roots and mildew, but it's warm, and warmth counts for a lot. As you stir, you remember something you overheard at the market, a trick some women use to dye spoiled flour white again. Bone ash, scraped from the hearth and mixed in just enough to give old, yellowed flour the illusion of freshness. It doesn't change the taste, just the colour, as if colour could change how it sits in your belly. Here's a weird one for you. Some bakers, when caught selling adulterated bread, defended themselves by claiming it was medicinal. That alum kept the bread fresh. That chalk helped digestion. One even argued that ground bones were a source of calcium. The courts didn't always buy it, but sometimes they did, especially if the victims were poor. After all, who would listen to a laundress with missing teeth or a chimney sweep coughing up blood? That brings us to the debate still grinding away in the archives. Was food adulteration driven by greed or necessity? Some scholars say it was the inevitable result of an under-regulated market, a mad scramble to feed a booming population with limited resources. Others argue it was pure exploitation, merchants squeezing profit from the already squeezed, knowing the poor had no choice but to buy whatever they were offered. Either way, the ones who paid were never the ones who decided. You spoon your mush into a bowl and sit at the table, knees drawn up for warmth, back hunched like an old woman even though you're barely out of childhood. You take a bite, then another. The bread dissolves into a pasty glue, thick and hot, and surprisingly comforting if you don't think too hard. The sand settles at the bottom of the bowl like sediment in a muddy river. You'll leave that last spoonful behind. You sip the broth slowly. Let it coat your stomach like armour. It's not a meal, not really, but it's enough to stop the hunger from gnawing through your spine. You feel sleep coming back. You set the bowl aside, wipe your mouth with your sleeve, and crawl back to bed, burrowing under your patchwork of blankets like a mole into earth. And lying there, half asleep, you wonder, how many people have eaten this same meal tonight? How many have crunched the same sand between their teeth? How many have swallowed poison and prayed it was just filler? You don't know, but you imagine them like stars, scattered across the city, flickering with hunger, each bowl of mush a tiny fire in the dark. You drift off eventually. The wind keeps blowing. The hunger keeps quiet for now. And in your dreams the bread is soft, the flour is clean, and nothing crunches unless it's sugar. Morning comes with a grey, listless sky, and the kind of light that doesn't feel like light at all. Just a paler shade of dark. You're already awake, of course. You've been up since the chimney started coughing smoke down the flue, and the neighbour's baby began wailing like the start of Judgment Day. But there's no time to lie around wondering if you'll feel better or worse when you stand up. You already know the answer. Today is the day you do what you swore you wouldn't. You go to the Bone Man. He's not officially called that, of course. He's just Mr. Crake, the man who sells bones out of a wooden stall by the slaughterhouse gate. But everyone in your street knows what he is. A dealer in fragments. A vendor of marrow and remnants. You walk there with a cloth-wrapped coin, eyes on the cobblestones, ignoring the way the butcher's gutters run red and stink like hot iron. The Bone Man is already busy. You stand behind a woman with 5 children and a man missing half his teeth. You all look like you're shopping for soup, but really you're hunting for survival. Today's historical fact. For the poorest in Victorian England, bones were not waste. They were the main event. Meat was often entirely out of reach, but bones could be boiled down for soup or broth, and if you were lucky, there might be a sliver of fat or gristle clinging on. Marrow bones were considered valuable, but even cracked and cleaned bones still held enough gelatin to thicken a pot of stew. Bone broth wasn't a trend. It was Tuesday. You get 3 bones for your coin, 1 large beef joint, hollow and pale, and 2 knobbly ones with thin ribbons of tendon still clinging on. You thank the Bone Man like he's saved your life, and maybe he has. You take them home, rinse off the grime and drop them into a pot already lined with onion peels, carrot tops, and a few limp sprigs of thyme scrounged from the alley. The broth simmers all day. You keep adding water, let it reduce. Add more, let it go again. It turns cloudy and gold and smells like something rich and ancient. You skim the top, pick out flecks of protein, and chew them like treasure. By evening, it's ready. You serve it with bread so dry it threatens to splinter your gums. But dipped into that broth, it becomes soft again, like hope. Here's your quirky detail. In some London households, a single bone might be boiled and reboiled for up to a week. The first day was for broth, the second for stew. By the third day, it flavoured porridge. By the fourth, it was boiled again with vinegar to extract calcium, bone tea. By the 6th, if there was anything left, the softened bone itself was sometimes ground up and added back into meals as filler. Waste was not just a sin. It was unaffordable. Your family eats in silence, not because the food is bad, but because it's better than expected. The marrow melted into the broth gives it a richness that feels luxurious, even decadent. No one talks, but your brother licks his spoon, and your mother hums softly through her nose. That's about as close as anyone gets to praise. The debate among scholars circles back here, again and again. Did the Victorian poor make miracles with nothing, or were they simply surviving in slow motion? Some romanticize it, speak of thrift and ingenuity, of how the poor could make a meal from air. Others argue that these meals were acts of quiet desperation, that survival became so creative only because the system had abandoned them entirely. A pot of bone broth wasn't resourcefulness, it was evidence. After dinner you save the bones. Of course you do. You wrap them in cloth and tuck them away. Tomorrow they'll go back into the pot. By Friday they'll barely flavour the water, but you'll boil them anyway. It's not about taste, it's about ritual, something hot, something to fill the space. You sit by the fire, such as it is, and think about the meals you've known. Bread that crunches with sand, pickles too sour to smile through, jelly that shakes like your hands when the fever starts, gravy made from dreams and flour, the vinegar that filled you up just long enough to keep moving, and now, the bones. Always the bones. You wonder if this is what your body will be made of someday. A lifetime of boiled down leftovers and hollow promises. You close your eyes and let your mind drift. Not to luxury, not to roast goose or golden puddings or sponge cakes glazed with real lemon. You don't need fantasy. You just want another pot, another bone, another evening where the broth holds off the cold a little longer. Tomorrow you'll boil the bones again, and the day after, and the day after that. You'll keep boiling until the water runs clear, the marrow is memory, and the bones whisper that they've given you everything they had. Only then will you let them go. And when you do, you'll walk past the butcher's gate, past the stalls, past the bone man, head up, belly warm, with just enough left in your pocket for another week of surviving. Because in this life, that's what eating really means. Not taste, not luxury, not even fullness. Just enough. Always just enough. Wind down. Final 300 words. You lie in bed now, full, not in the way the rich mean it, not stuffed or satisfied, but full enough to sleep without flinching. The house is dark. The coals in the hearth are down to a faint glow, flickering like old memories. Around you, the quiet hum of the night carries the same rhythm it always does. A cough from the next room, the shuffle of rats between the walls, the occasional drip from a cracked ceiling tile. But your belly is warm, your bones don't ache, you've eaten. That's enough. This world, your world, doesn't ask for grand feasts or golden forks. It asks only that you last until morning, that you take what scraps you can, make them stretch, and turn them into something edible, something just shy of terrible. And you've done that. With bread that chews like gravel, soup made from bones long since abandoned, vinegar sipped like wine, and stolen pudding crusts that taste like forbidden fruit. You've survived every bite. Every bland, grey, bitter, greasy, half-rotten, overboiled bite. Because this is what real survival looked like in the Victorian era. Not gaslit ballrooms and cucumber sandwiches, but quiet kitchens, rationed drippings, stomachs learning to be patient. You foraged, begged, borrowed, and boiled your way through an era that promised so little and delivered even less. And still, somehow, you made it. So now, let your eyes close. Let your hands unclench. Let your stomach settle into that rare, sacred quiet. You've earned this sleep. You've earned the softness of the blanket pulled up to your chin, and the slow breath that says, for tonight at least, you're okay. Tomorrow will ask more of you, but that's tomorrow. Tonight, you rest.